My name is Caleb Jordan. At my daughter's wedding, in front of all her rich and powerful friends, she pointed at me and called me human trash. I didn't say a word. I just turned around and walked out of her perfect, expensive life. She thought she had won, that she had finally scrubbed the grease of her working-class past from her beautiful white dress. She didn't know that I had already arranged my own wedding gift, a little video presentation. And when it played a few hours later, her new husband didn't just ask for a divorce. He had her escorted from the premises. Before I tell you how a father's love can curdle into a cold, hard, and necessary justice, I'd be honored if you let me know in the comments where you're listening to my story from. And please hit that like and subscribe button if you believe that a person's character is more important than their bank account. The wedding was at a place called the Kiowa River Resort, a sprawling, impossibly green fantasy of a place just outside Charleston. I drove my old but reliable truck through gates that were bigger than my first apartment down a long driveway lined with ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss. It was like driving into a different world, a world where the grass was a shade of green I'd only ever seen in magazines, a world that smelled of money and salt air. I was a head mechanic for the city bus depot for 40 years. I knew the smell of diesel, of hot metal, of honest sweat. This place smelled of none of those things. It smelled of perfume and privilege. A young man in a crisp uniform that probably cost more than my suit took my keys with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. As I stepped out, I felt a familiar, uncomfortable feeling. It was the feeling of being an outsider, a ghost from a different life haunting this perfect, polished world. I had raised my daughter Lena to be strong, to be better than me, to reach for a life I could never give her. And looking around at the grand white-columned clubhouse, at the string quartet playing softly on a manicured lawn overlooking the ocean, it was clear she had succeeded beyond my wildest dreams. I just hadn't realized that in her climb she would find it necessary to saw off the branch she had come from. I saw him first, David, my future son-in-law. He was a good man, a kind and earnest architect, with a smile as open and as honest as his blueprints. He saw me, and his face broke into a genuine welcoming grin. He strode over, his hand outstretched, pulling me into a warm, strong hug. "Cal," he said, his voice full of a sincere happiness that was a rare currency in this place. "You made it. I am so glad you're here. You have to see the setup for the ceremony. It looks incredible." He treated me not like an embarrassing old relative, but like an honored guest, like a father. He made me feel seen. And then I saw her, my daughter, Lena. She was a vision, a queen in her own fairy tale. Her dress was a cloud of white silk that shimmered in the afternoon sun, her hair swept up in a design so intricate it must have taken hours. She was standing with a group of women who all looked like they had stepped out of the same fashion magazine, their laughter a light tinkling sound as carefully arranged as the flowers on the tables. David led me over. "Look who's here, honey," he said, his voice full of love for her. Lena turned, and her smile, which had been so bright and dazzling for her friends, faltered for a fraction of a second when she saw me. It was a tiny thing, a flicker of an emotion I couldn't quite name, annoyance, embarrassment, before it was replaced by a perfect, practiced brilliance. "Daddy," she said, gliding over. She leaned in and gave me a hug that was all air and expensive perfume, her cheek barely brushing mine before she pulled away. "You made it. I was getting worried." Her words said one thing, but her body language, the slight, almost imperceptible distance she kept between us, said another. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, baby girl," I said, my voice a little rougher than I intended. "The place looks beautiful," I added, trying to find my footing. "It's perfect, isn't it?" she replied, but her eyes weren't on me. They were already scanning the crowd behind me, her gaze flitting from one important guest to another. I was a box she had to check, a duty she had to perform before she could get back to the real business of her wedding networking. "David, honey, isn't that the CEO from the architectural firm you wanted to talk to? You should go say hello." She was already managing the room, positioning her new husband like a chess piece. David, ever the good man, gave my shoulder a final warm squeeze. "We'll talk more later, Cal," he promised, and then he was gone, swallowed up by the sea of expensive suits. I was left standing there next to my own daughter, feeling like an exhibit in a museum. She asked me a few perfunctory questions about my drive down, about my health, her smile never wavering, her eyes never really seeing me. I was a story she had to tell the humble working-class father who had worked his fingers to the bone so his brilliant daughter could have this perfect day. I was a useful prop. But I was just a prop. The distance between us was more than just the few inches of air. It was a canyon of ambition, of class, of a lifetime of choices that had led her here to this grand performance and had left me on the other side a spectator who was no longer allowed backstage. My daughter, my beautiful Lena, left me standing there a ghost at her own wedding. The sea of smiling, wealthy strangers parted for her and then closed behind her, leaving me on an island of my own making. I was a man in a simple dark suit in a world of shimmering pastels and designer labels. I was a calloused hand in a room full of soft, manicured fingers. I was a relic, and I had never felt it more acutely than in that moment. David, a good man, was busy being the perfect groom, and my daughter was busy being the perfect hostess. I was a loose end, a piece of the past that didn't quite fit into the perfect picture of her future. I couldn't stand there and make small talk about the stock market or summering in the Hamptons. It wasn't my world. It wasn't my language. I needed to breathe air that didn't smell of money and ambition. I turned and walked away from the main terrace, leaving the sound of the string quartet and the light tinkling laughter behind me. My path took me along a quiet manicured walkway, a river of old Charleston brick, winding through a garden that was almost unnaturally perfect. The azaleas were in full, glorious bloom, their colors so vibrant they hurt the eyes. The air was heavy with the sweet, cloying scent of jasmine. It was a beautiful place, but it felt like a stage set, a carefully constructed illusion with no real heart. I walked for a few minutes, my hands in my pockets, my old polished work shoes feeling heavy and out of place on the pristine bricks. I was heading toward a small, secluded courtyard the resort map had called the Serenity Garden. The name felt like a promise. As I rounded a tall, thick hedge of sweet olive, I heard voices. They were not the light, cheerful voices of the party. They were low, intense, and strained, a man and a woman. The man's voice was a low, impatient rumble. The woman's was a sharp, urgent hiss. I stopped, not wanting to intrude, but something in the tension of their tones held me there, an unwilling eavesdropper. I took a half-step forward, and through a gap in the hedge I saw them. It was my daughter Lena, her back to me, a perfect white column of silk. And standing in front of her too close was the best man, a man I knew was David's business partner, Trevor Hayes. He was a handsome man, I suppose, in that slick, overconfident way that has always set my teeth on edge. He looked like a man who had never been told no in his life. They hadn't seen me. They were in their own world, a small, intense bubble of conflict. I couldn't hear every word, just snippets, fragments that floated on the jasmine-scented air. "Being ridiculous," Trevor was saying, his voice a low growl. "It doesn't have to change anything. It's a contract." "Don't say that here, Trevor," Lena hissed back, her head darting around nervously. "Not now. Someone could hear. Everything is perfect. Don't you dare ruin this." "Perfect," he said with a short, humorless laugh. "Lena, this is a business transaction and you know it. The merger is complete. Let's not pretend it's anything else." The words, what little I heard of them, made no sense. Business transaction, merger. But it was what happened next that made the blood in my veins run cold. Trevor reached out and grabbed Lena's bare arm. His grip not rough, but possessive, commanding. "Don't get sentimental on me now," he said, his voice dropping even lower. He ran his thumb slowly, deliberately up the inside of her arm, from her elbow to her shoulder. It was not a friendly touch. It was not a comforting touch. It was a touch of ownership, a touch that spoke of a deep and inappropriate familiarity. I held my breath, waiting for her to pull away. I waited for her to slap his hand to tell him to get lost, to defend the honor of the man she was about to marry. But she didn't. She froze. Her shoulders tensed and she glanced around again, her eyes wide with a fear not of his touch, but of being seen. She did not pull her arm away. She allowed it. And in that single, terrible moment of inaction, a seed of a deep and ugly suspicion was planted in the soil of my heart. My mind, the mind of a mechanic who has spent a lifetime diagnosing problems by listening for the one sound that doesn't belong, went into high gear. The tense, secret conversation. The words business transaction, the possessive, intimate touch. and her quiet, fearful compliance. None of it fit. It was a knocking sound in an engine that was supposed to be running smoothly. It was a sign of a deep, fundamental problem hidden just beneath the polished, perfect surface. They parted a moment later, Trevor giving her arm a final proprietary squeeze before walking away in the opposite direction. Lena stood there for a second, composing herself, smoothing down the front of her perfect dress, reassembling the mask of the perfect, happy bride. Then she too walked away, back towards the party, back towards her future husband, completely unaware that her father had seen everything. I retreated, my own heart a cold, heavy lump in my chest. I walked back the way I came, the beautiful flowers now seeming sinister, their sweet scent now smelling of rot. I rejoined the party, a ghost with a terrible secret. I saw my daughter link her arm through David's, laughing up at him, her face a perfect picture of adoration. And David, my good, honest, unsuspecting David, looked down at her with a love so pure and so total, it was a physical pain to witness. He saw a queen, a goddess. I no longer knew what I was seeing. I was just a simple working-class man, but I knew this much: something was terribly, terribly wrong. And I, the human trash from her past, was the only one who had seen it. The image of my daughter and Trevor in that secluded garden was a splinter in my mind. I tried to push it away. I tried to tell myself I was an old man misreading a situation, seeing ghosts where there were none. I tried to focus on the joy of the day, on the happiness of my future son-in-law David, on the pride I was supposed to be feeling as the father of the bride. But the image would not leave. The casual, proprietary way Trevor had touched her arm, and the way she had allowed it. It was a wrong note in a song that was supposed to be perfect, and the longer I listened, the louder it became. The time for the ceremony was approaching. The guests were beginning to find their seats on the rows of white chairs set up on the great lawn overlooking the ocean. The string quartet had started playing again. I was supposed to be feeling a father's nervous pride. Instead, all I felt was a cold, creeping dread. I could not in good conscience walk my daughter down that aisle and hand her over to a good man like David without giving her one last chance to be honest, to be the woman I had raised her to be. I made my way through the bustling resort against the tide of smiling, well-dressed guests and found the bridal suite. It was a scene of controlled, festive chaos. Ashley's bridesmaids were a cloud of pastel silk and hairspray, their laughter high and bright. A makeup artist was dabbing a final touch of powder on my daughter's nose as she stared at her own reflection in a massive, ornate mirror. She was breathtaking, a queen surveying her kingdom just before her coronation. I stood in the doorway for a moment, an old, working-class man in a simple suit, a ghost at the feast. One of the bridesmaids saw me, and her smile faltered. "Mr. Jordan," she said, "Lena is just about to get ready." "I need 1 minute," I said, my voice quiet but firm, carrying a weight that made her step aside. "Alone. With my daughter. Before I walk her down the aisle." It was a request that, even in this strange new world, could not be refused. The bridesmaids and the makeup artist filed out of the room, their curious backward glances like tiny daggers. The door clicked shut, and suddenly the room was quiet. The festive energy evaporated, replaced by a tense, heavy silence. Lena did not turn from the mirror. She just looked at my reflection, standing behind hers. "Daddy," she said, her voice laced with an impatient, patronizing sweetness, "this really isn't a good time. We're on a very tight schedule." I walked over and stood beside her so that our reflections were side by side in the mirror. She was so beautiful, and so terribly, terribly fragile for all her ambition. "Your mother." I began, my voice a low, soft rumble. "Always said this would be the most beautiful day of your life." She was right. "You look like a queen baby girl." A flicker of a real, genuine smile touched her lips. "Thank you, Daddy." "I've been talking with David." I continued, my gaze still on our reflections. "He is a good man, Lena, the kind of man your mother always hoped you would find. He's honest, he's decent, he's strong in a quiet way, and he loves you with his whole heart. A man like that, a love like that, is a rare and precious thing in this world. I hope you know that." Her smile became a little more fixed, a little more strained. She knew this was not just a father's sentimental ramblings. This was a prelude. "Of course I know that," she said. I turned from the mirror to face her, directly forcing her to look away from her own perfect image and see me. "I just need to say one thing to you," I said. "Not as a judge, not as a critic. just as your father. That man out there waiting for you at the end of that aisle, his entire world is about to become you. When you take his hand, you are taking his heart. And a good man's heart is a heavy, fragile thing to hold. Be careful with it, Lena. Please, be careful. I paused, holding her gaze, willing her to hear the real meaning behind my words. Marriage, a real one, the kind your mother and I had, is built on one thing above all else. It's built on truth, on honesty, on knowing that the person standing beside you is who they say they are. When you stand out there and you say those vows to him, I need you to make sure you mean them, every single one of them. I need you to make sure there are no secrets standing between you and him. You owe him that. More than that, you owe yourself that. The color drained from her face. Her eyes, which had been bright and confident, were now wide with a sudden cold alarm. She knew. She knew this was not a generic lecture. She knew I had seen something. The smile vanished completely, replaced by a mask of icy defensive fury. "What are you trying to say?" She hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper. "That I'm not good enough for him. That I'm going to mess it up on my wedding day of all the days you choose now to come in here and give me a lecture on honesty. After everything I've done, everything I've built to make this day perfect." She was deflecting, turning my quiet plea for her to be a good person into an attack on her success. It was a masterful and horrifying piece of emotional jujitsu. She did not ask, "What did you see?" She did not try to reassure me, she just attacked. And in that attack, I had my answer. The seed of suspicion that had been planted in the garden now felt like a cold, hard certainty. There was a soft knock on the door. "Lena, 5 minutes," a voice called from the other side. The moment was broken. I had said what I needed to say. I had given her one last final chance to choose the path of honesty. "You look beautiful, baby girl," I said again, my voice now just a tired, sad whisper. I turned and walked to the door, leaving her standing there, a perfect bride in a perfect dress, her face a mask of cold, terrified fury. As I stepped out into the hallway to take my place, I knew with a father's aching heart that the wedding was a lie, and I had no idea what I was going to do about it. The gentle warning I had offered my daughter, a plea for her to honor the good man she was about to marry, was not received as an act of love. It was received as an act of war. I saw the transformation happen in the mirror and then in her eyes as she turned to face me. The soft, beautiful face of the bride hardened, the warmth in her eyes freezing over, replaced by the cold, hard glitter of a cornered animal. The fear I had glimpsed in the garden, the fear of being seen, now manifested itself as a swift and brutal rage. "A lecture," she hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper that was 1,000 times more chilling than any shout. "You chose today, 5 minutes before I walked down that aisle, you come in here to give me a lecture on honesty." She took a step towards me, the magnificent white dress which had seemed so angelic just moments before, now looking like the battle armor of a furious queen. "How dare you!" I stood my ground, my heart a heavy leaden thing in my chest. "Lena, that wasn't a lecture. It was a father's hope for his daughter's happiness." She let out a short, sharp, and utterly mirthless laugh. "My happiness," she said, her eyes sweeping over my simple suit, my worn but polished shoes, my calloused mechanic's hands, with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. "You have no idea what my happiness looks like. You've never understood it. You've never liked any of this, have you?" She gestured around the opulent bridal suite at the champagne bottles chilling in silver buckets at the view of the ocean through the massive windows. "You've never liked that I was marrying a man like David, that I was building a life you could never have dreamed of giving me." Her words were sharp, and they were meant to wound. "You're a mechanic, Daddy." She said the word daddy, now an insult, a condescending pat on the head. "You live in a world of grease and broken parts and punching a clock. You don't understand this world. This is a world of influence, of image, of perfection, and you just can't stand to see me have it, can you? You had to come in here on the most important day of my life and try to spoil it with your sad working-class morality plays." The insult, the casual cruelty of it stole the air from my lungs. My entire life, the honest hard work I had poured into raising her, the pride I had taken in providing for my family was just grease and broken parts to her, a past to be ashamed of, a morality to be mocked. In that moment, the loving, complicated daughter I knew vanished, and in her place stood a stranger, a cold, ambitious woman I did not recognize at all. It was the woman my wife Ruby had always seen, the one with the hollow heart. This day, she continued, her voice now a low, menacing command, is the culmination of everything I have ever worked for. It is perfect. Every detail is perfect, and you will not ruin it. You will not. She took another step until she was right in front of me, her beautiful face a mask of cold fury. Your job today is simple. You will walk me down that aisle. You will smile for the pictures as you give me away. You will sit at your table and make polite conversation with the other guests. And you will keep your lectures, your suspicions, and your opinions to yourself. Am I making myself perfectly clear? I looked into her eyes and I saw no love. I saw no fear of hurting me. I saw only the frantic, terrified anger of a guilty person who was lashing out at the one who had come too close to seeing the truth. And her reaction, her vicious, defensive rage, was the final damning piece of evidence. The quiet, ugly suspicion I had felt in the garden was now a roaring, absolute certainty. She was betraying the good man who was waiting for her outside. She was walking into this marriage on a foundation of lies. There was a soft knock on the door. "Lena, it's time!" The wedding planner's voice called out, cheerful and oblivious. The spell was broken. Lena stepped back, her face instantly reassembling itself into a mask of bridal calm, though her eyes were still as cold and as hard as diamonds. I just looked at her, the daughter I had lost, the stranger who wore her face. The father in me, the man who had wanted to save her from herself, died in that room. And the judge, the part of me that had been dormant for so long, the part that weighed evidence and delivered verdicts, quietly took his place. "I understand," I said, my voice as cold and as empty as I felt. "Perfectly." I turned without another word and walked out of the room, leaving her to her perfect day. My job was to walk her down the aisle, and I would do my job. But I was no longer a father leading his beloved daughter to her happiness. I was an escort, a grim, silent official leading a beautiful, smiling criminal to the scene of her next crime. And my mind, no longer clouded by hope, began to work on a new and terrible problem. What does justice for a man like David Clark look like? The walk down the aisle was the longest 10 yards of my life. My arm was linked through my daughter's, her hand resting lightly on my sleeve, but I could have been a stranger, a hired escort. Her smile was a brilliant, blinding thing, aimed at the crowd, at the cameras, at the handsome, beaming man waiting for her at the end of the path. It was a performance of pure, unadulterated joy, and it was the most convincing lie I had ever seen. I, who knew the cold, hard fury that lay just beneath that perfect surface, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. My job was simple. When we reached the altar, the minister asked the traditional question, "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" I was supposed to say, "Her mother and I do." I said the words. The sound came from my mouth, but it felt like it belonged to someone else. I placed my daughter's hand into David's, a good, honest hand. I looked at David, at his eyes so full of love and trust, and a wave of profound, terrible guilt washed over me. I was a conspirator in this crime. I was helping to hand over this good man's heart to a woman I now knew would not be careful with it. I gave her a final formal kiss on the cheek. She did not look at me. Her eyes were only for David. I stepped back and took my seat in the front row, a ghost in my own story. The ceremony was beautiful, I suppose. The vows they exchanged were poetic, full of promises of forever, of honesty, of a shared future. Every word that came from my daughter's lips felt like a lie, a beautifully delivered line in a play. And when David, his own voice thick with an emotion so real it was almost painful to witness, promised to love and honor and protect her, all I could think was, "And who, my boy, is going to protect you?" The reception began immediately after. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and purple. The guests moved from the lawn to a massive, elegant terrace overlooking the sea. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays of champagne and impossibly tiny, intricate appetizers. The string quartet had been replaced by a smooth jazz band, the music a low, sophisticated thrum beneath the happy chatter. I stood by a stone balustrade, a glass of sparkling water in my hand, looking out at the ocean. I could not bring myself to mingle. I could not bring myself to make small talk, to smile, to pretend that my heart was not a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I watched my daughter. She was in her element. She was a queen holding court, gliding from one group of laughing wealthy guests to another. Her smile never faltering, her charm a weapon she wielded with expert precision. She was everything she had ever wanted to be, and she was a complete and utter stranger to me. I was so lost in my own thoughts that I didn't see the man approach me until he was standing beside me. He was older, distinguished, with a kind, intelligent face. "That was a beautiful ceremony," he said, his voice a warm baritone. "You must be very proud of your daughter." I recognized him from a picture David had once shown me. He was a senior partner at a major architectural firm, a man whose respect could make or break David's career. I said, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. We made small talk for a moment, about the weather, about the beauty of the resort. He was a kind man, a man like David. A moment later, Lena herself glided over, her smile somehow even brighter. "Mr. Abernathy," she said, touching the older man's arm with a practiced familiarity. "I'm so glad you could make it." "I wouldn't have missed it, Lena," he said, beaming at her. "Your father and I were just talking. He's a good man. You can tell a lot about a person by their father." He gestured toward me, and in that moment I saw the flicker again, the same one I had seen in the bridal suite, the flash of cold reptilian annoyance. Mr. Abernathy's simple, kind words had linked her in front of this powerful man to me, to the grease-stained mechanic from her past. It was a stain on her perfect designer picture, and she, in an act of social self-preservation so swift and so brutal it took my breath away, decided to erase the stain. She laughed. It was not a happy sound. It was a sharp, dismissive, and condescending sound. She looked at Mr. Abernathy, but her words were aimed at me, a volley of shots fired at point-blank range. "Oh, my father," she said, her voice loud enough for the small group of people around us to hear clearly. "Don't pay any attention to him. He's sweet in his own way." She then leaned in as if sharing a charming, harmless little secret. "He's just an old mechanic, bless his heart. Honestly, he's just a piece of human trash from my past that I'm still, for some reason, obligated to drag around." The words hung in the salt-tinged air. Human trash. The world went silent. The sound of the jazz band, the laughter of the guests, the crash of the ocean waves, it all faded away into a dull, roaring silence in my ears. I felt the blood drain from my face. I could feel the polite, embarrassed stares of the people around us. Mr. Abernathy's kind smile froze, then collapsed into a look of pure, horrified shock. He didn't know what to say. I looked at my daughter. Her face was a mask of perfect, smiling social grace, but her eyes, her cold, hard, triumphant eyes, were locked on mine. And in them I saw the truth. This was not a slip of the tongue. This was not a joke that had landed badly. This was a declaration, a public execution. She was not just disowning me. She was erasing me, turning me into a funny, pathetic anecdote for her new important friends. The pain was a physical thing, a white-hot blade that plunged into my chest and twisted. It was the pain of a love that has been not just rejected, but desecrated. In that moment, the last lingering shred of the father who had hoped to save her, the man who had just an hour before pleaded with her to be honest, died. It shriveled up and turned to dust. I did not yell, I did not cry, I did not make a scene. I simply held her gaze for one long final moment. And in my eyes I am sure she saw the death of the man she had always known as her father. I calmly, and with a hand that was now perfectly steady, placed my untouched glass of water on a passing waiter's tray. I gave Mr. Abernathy a single somber nod of apology. And then, without another word, I turned my back on my daughter, on her perfect party, on her new, perfect life. And I began to walk away. The words, when they came, were not a shout. They were a quiet, perfectly enunciated statement delivered with a bright social smile. And they were the cruelest words I had ever heard in my 75 years. Human trash, a piece of my past that I am obligated to drag around. My own daughter. The world did not just go silent. It ceased to exist. The sound of the jazz band, the cheerful clinking of glasses, the soft murmur of the ocean in the distance, it all vanished, sucked into a roaring white-hot void that opened up inside my own head. I was vaguely aware of the other people in the small circle around us. I could feel their sudden, horrified stillness. I could feel their polite, embarrassed stares, not looking at Lena, but at me, the piece of trash that had just been publicly discarded. Mr. Abernathy, the kind, distinguished man I had been speaking with, had an expression of pure, unadulterated shock on his face, his mouth slightly agape. I looked at my daughter, my beautiful, brilliant, and monstrous daughter. Her smile was still in place, a perfect, dazzling thing, but her eyes, her cold, hard eyes, were locked on mine. And in them I saw no remorse. I saw no regret. I saw only a chilling, triumphant finality. This was not a mistake. This was a message. A public declaration of her own emancipation from the grease-stained working-class world I represented. She was not just disowning me, she was erasing me. She was turning her own father into a piece of amusing, pathetic backstory for her new important friends. The pain was a physical thing. It was not the sharp, clean pain of a cut. It was the dull, tearing, agonizing pain of something being ripped from my very soul. It was the pain of a lifetime of love, of sacrifice, of scraped knees and bedtime stories and patched-up tires being taken, weighed, and declared worthless. In that moment, I felt the last lingering ember of the father who had hoped to save her from herself, the man who had pleaded with her to be honest, just an hour before simply turn to ash and blow away. The man she had just called trash in that moment became a ghost. And a ghost does not get angry. A ghost does not yell. A ghost does not make a scene. A ghost simply observes. With a calmness that I did not recognize as my own, a calmness that came from a place beyond pain. I took the untouched glass of sparkling water from my hand. A waiter was passing by with an empty silver tray. With a hand that was now perfectly unnaturally steady, I placed the glass on the tray. The small click of glass on silver was the only sound in my silent world. I turned my head and gave Mr. Abernathy a single somber nod. It was not an apology for my daughter's behavior. It was an apology for his having to witness it. He just stared back, his face a mask of horrified pity. And then I looked back at Lena one last time. I held her gaze, and in my own eyes I am sure she saw the death of the man she had always known as her father. I saw a flicker of something in her expression then, not regret, but a flash of cold, sharp, and dawning fear. The fear of a person who has just pushed someone too far and is only now beginning to understand the consequences. Without another word, without another look, I turned my back on her perfect party, on her new perfect life, and I began to walk away. My steps were not hurried. They were slow, measured, and deliberate. The steps of a man who is not retreating but is simply leaving a place where he no longer belongs. The crowd of beautiful, laughing people seemed to part from me as I walked, a silent, invisible wave of my own grief pushing them aside. They could feel it. They could see the ghost walking through their celebration. As I reached the edge of the terrace, I looked across the lawn. I saw David. He was standing with a group of friends, his back to me, laughing at some joke. He was so happy, so completely, blissfully, and heartbreakingly unaware of the poison that had just been revealed in the heart of the woman he had married. And in that moment, my own grief was eclipsed by a new, cold clarity. This was not about my wounded pride. This was about him, about justice for him. My daughter had not just called me trash, she had called him a fool, and that was a crime that could not be allowed to stand. I continued my walk, past the valets in their crisp uniforms, past the grand white columns of the clubhouse. I walked until the sound of the music was just a faint, pathetic thrum behind me. I walked until the scent of jasmine and money was replaced by the clean, sharp smell of the salt marsh. I reached my old, dusty truck, a piece of my past that I was not ashamed of, and I got in. I did not look back. There was nothing left to look back at. The father had left the building, and the judge was now in session. The truck started with a low, familiar rumble, a sound of honest, reliable machinery that was a world away from the soft, sophisticated thrum of the jazz band I had left behind. I pulled out of the resort's sprawling parking lot, my movement steady and automatic. I didn't speed. I didn't squeal the tires. I just drove, leaving the world of Spanish moss and champagne and casual cruelty in my rearview mirror until it was just a glittering, distant memory. My mind was a quiet, empty space. The shock had been so total, so absolute, that it had short-circuited all my emotions. There was no anger, no sorrow, just a vast, gray, and silent numbness. The words echoed in that emptiness, stripped of their emotional impact, now just a simple clinical fact. Human trash. I drove for what felt like hours, with no destination, just following the ribbons of asphalt as they unwound before my headlights. And as the miles passed, as the perfect manicured world of the resort gave way to the familiar, imperfect reality of the city, the numbness began to recede, and in its place a ghost slipped into the passenger seat beside me. It was my wife, Ruby. She'd been gone for 10 years, but in that moment her presence was so real I could almost smell her scent, a mix of lavender and the faint, clean smell of the laundry soap she always used. I could hear her voice, not with my ears, but in my memory, a voice that was always low and steady, a voice that had been the anchor of my life for 45 years. And the memory that came was not a gentle one. It was a warning, a prophecy I had been too proud and too blind to hear. It was the day Lena had graduated from college summa cum laude. We were standing on the lawn of the university, surrounded by thousands of cheering families. I was a man overflowing with a pride so immense it felt like it was going to burst from my chest. My daughter, the first in our family to get a degree, had done it. She was holding her diploma, her face a mask of triumphant joy. Later that evening, after the celebratory dinner, Ruby and I were sitting on our back porch, the same one where we had sat for 1,000 quiet evenings. I was still floating, replaying the day's events in my head. "Can you believe it, Ruby?" I had said, my voice full of awe. "Our girl. Look what she's done. She's going to take on the world." Ruby was quiet for a long time, watching the fireflies begin to blink in the twilight. "Yes," she finally said, her voice soft and thoughtful. "She will. She'll conquer it." There was a strange, sad note in her voice that I didn't understand. "What's that supposed to mean?" I had asked a little defensively. She turned to look at me. Her eyes, those wise, perceptive eyes that had always seen the hidden cracks in things, were full of a deep and complicated love. "I am so proud of her, Cal," she said. "You know that. She is brilliant, and she is strong, and she is beautiful. But I worry about her. Worry about Lena." "She's got the world on a string," I had said with a laugh. "That's what I worry about," Ruby had replied, her voice barely a whisper. "She doesn't just want to succeed in the world, Cal. She wants to own it. There's a difference. It's a hunger in her. And I don't know where it comes from, but it's there. It's like she has a hole in the middle of her heart, and she thinks if she just fills it with enough success, enough money, enough admiration, it will finally be full. But a hole like that, it can never be filled. It just gets bigger." I remember feeling a prickle of annoyance. "You're being too hard on her, Ruby. She's ambitious. That's a good thing. We raised her to be. We raised her to be a good person," she had corrected me gently. "And she is. But that ambition, it's cold. It's a fire with no warmth. And I worry that one day she will have to choose between that ambition and her own heart. Between the things she wants and the people she loves. And I'm scared of the choice she will make." She had reached out and placed her hand on mine. "Just watch out for her, Cal, and watch out for your own heart when you're around her." Sitting there in the cold cab of my truck, her words came back to me not as a memory but as a verdict. She had seen it all, the hole in Lena's heart, the cold ambition, the inevitable choice between the things she wanted and the people she loved. Today at her wedding she had made that choice. She had chosen the admiration of a rich man she barely knew over the father who had given her his entire life. And she had done it with a casual, smiling cruelty that proved my wife's every fear had been right. The profound, aching grief of missing my wife, a wound that had become a dull, constant scar, now tore itself open anew, fresh and raw and agonizing. But this time it was mixed with a new bitter flavor, regret. I hadn't just been betrayed by my daughter. I had failed my wife. I had failed to listen to her wisdom. I had failed to see the danger she had so clearly pointed out. I pulled the truck over into the dark, empty parking lot of a closed-down diner. I rested my forehead against the cold plastic of the steering wheel. The silence in the cab was absolute. The pain of my daughter's words was still there, a white-hot brand on my soul, but it was now joined by the cold, clear voice of my wife's memory. She had seen the truth, and she had trusted me to be the guardian of that truth, to protect our family from the hollow heart she had seen in our own child. I had failed in that duty for 10 long years since her passing. But tonight, sitting alone in the darkness, I made a new vow, a quiet, solemn promise to her memory. I would not fail her again. The time for blind fatherly love was over. The time for a clear-eyed, painful justice had begun. As I drove away from that palace of glass and Spanish moss, my mind was a hollow, echoing chamber. My daughter's words, "human trash," were a graffiti tag spray-painted over every good memory I had of her. My wife Ruby was a warm and constant presence in that emptiness, her memory a flickering candle in a vast, dark room. Her old warnings about Lena's cold ambition, once dismissed, were now the only truth I had left to hold on to. A man I thought can survive any insult to his pride. But what can he do with a wound to his heart? I didn't know. I just drove. And as I drove, my mind, seeking any refuge from the present pain, drifted further back to a memory that was the complete opposite of the one I had just endured. A memory of a beginning, not an ending. The day I first met David Clark. It was about 3 years ago, a hot, sticky Saturday in the heart of a Charleston summer. My old air conditioning unit at home had finally given up the ghost, and I was in my garage wrestling with it, covered in sweat grease and a profound sense of frustration. It was a big, complicated job, the kind that my 72-year-old back was not happy about. The phone rang, and it was Lena. "Daddy," she'd said, her voice full of that bright, cheerful energy she used when she was about to ask for something. "I have someone I want you to meet. We're in the neighborhood. Can we stop by for a minute?" "It's not a great time, baby girl," I had grumbled. "I'm in the middle of a war with this AC unit, and the AC unit is winning." "Oh, that's perfect," she'd said, completely ignoring my tone. "He'll love that. We'll be there in 5. Before I could protest, she had hung up. A few minutes later, a sleek, expensive-looking car I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway. Lena got out, looking cool and perfect in a white summer dress, and with her was a young man. He was tall and well-dressed, but he had a kind, slightly nervous energy about him. This was David. He walked over to my garage, which was a controlled chaos of tools and machine parts, and he didn't flinch. He just smiled a genuine, open smile and stuck out his hand. "Mr. Jordan," he said, "it's an honor to meet you. Lena has told me so much about you." His handshake was firm and honest. Lena stood in the doorway, a look of faint, pained embarrassment on her face, as she surveyed the greasy reality of her father's life. "Daddy, this is David," she said, as if presenting a rare and exotic bird. David, however, was not looking at the mess. He was looking at the guts of the air conditioner, a complex web of wires, coils, and compressors. "Wow," he said, his voice full of a real, unforced interest. "That's an old Bryant unit, isn't it? My grandfather had one just like it. They were built like tanks." I was taken aback. Most of the young men Lena had brought around over the years had looked at my garage with a kind of polite, distant horror, as if they had stumbled upon a primitive and slightly dangerous tribe. This young man looked at it with a genuine and knowledgeable curiosity. "It is," I said, a little surprised, "and this tank has finally sprung a leak I can't seem to find." "Mind if I take a look?" he asked, already starting to roll up the sleeves of his expensive-looking linen shirt. "David, no," Lena had said quickly, her voice sharp with mortification. "You'll get dirty. Daddy has it under control." But David just smiled at her. "It's okay, honey. I like this stuff." He knelt beside me on the oily concrete, peering into the machine's innards. "My dad was an engineer," he explained to me. "He always said you can't design a good machine if you don't know how to take one apart." For the next hour we worked. He was smart, his mind quick and logical, the mind of an architect. He asked intelligent questions. He handed me the right tools without me having to ask, and he wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. We found the leak a tiny hairline crack in a copper coolant line, and together we figured out a way to patch it. All the while, Lena stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her smile tight, a look of profound and growing impatience on her face. This was not how she had planned this meeting. She had wanted to present her successful, handsome new boyfriend to her quaint, working-class father for a brief, charming visit. She had not planned for her boyfriend to spend an hour on his knees in a puddle of grease. When we were finished, covered in sweat and grime, David stood up, a triumphant grin on his face. "We did it, Cal," he said, calling me by the nickname I hadn't heard from a young man in years. He looked at the old rumbling AC unit with a look of real satisfaction. Later, as they were leaving, he pulled me aside for a moment. "Thank you for letting me help, sir." he said, his voice full of a sincere respect that I had not felt from anyone in a very long time. "And for what it's worth, I love your daughter very much, and I'm going to spend my life making her happy." I stood on my porch and watched them drive away. Lena, I knew, was furious, but I was not. My heart, which had been heavy with the lonely work of an old man, was suddenly light. I had not just met my daughter's new boyfriend. I had met a good man. An honest man. A man who was not afraid of work, who respected his elders, and who loved my daughter. He was the son I had never had. And in that moment I believed with all my foolish, hopeful father's heart that he was the one who could finally truly make her happy. I believed he was the one who could finally fill that hollow place in her heart that Ruby had always worried about. I had never been more wrong in my life. The first year of my daughter's engagement to David was on the surface a happy time. The man I had met in my garage, the man who was not afraid of a little grease, proved to be every bit as good and as decent as I had hoped. He treated my daughter like she was the center of the universe, and more than that, he treated me with a warmth and a respect that was deeply healing. He would call me not out of duty, but just to talk. He'd ask for my advice on a leaky faucet in their new apartment, or he'd invite me over to watch a football game. He would listen with genuine interest to my old stories about the bus depot, about the city as it used to be. For the first time since my Serena had passed, I felt like I had a son. But as the months wore on, the quiet, ugly suspicion that had been planted in my heart in that resort garden, the suspicion my wife's memory had watered, began to grow. It grew because I watched my daughter Lena through the eyes of a father who was now finally paying attention. With David's ring on her finger and his credit card in her wallet, a new side of my daughter began to emerge. Or rather, an old side that Ruby had always seen, a side that I had always made excuses for, now came into full bloom. The ambition that had once been a sharp driving force for her own success now became a voracious appetite for his. Her life became a whirlwind of spending. There was the redecorating of their already beautiful apartment, a project that seemed to involve replacing every piece of perfectly good furniture with something twice as expensive. There were the weekend trips, the new clothes, the dinners at restaurants where the price of an appetizer was what I used to spend on a week's worth of groceries. David, blinded by his love for her, saw it all as a way of making her happy. "She has such incredible taste, Cal," he would say to me with a proud, happy laugh. "She's making our home beautiful." But I saw something else. I saw a feverish, almost desperate need to acquire, to consume, to surround herself with the symbols of a wealth she had not earned. It was the hole in her heart that Ruby had talked about, and she was trying to fill it with Italian leather and French crystal. Worse than the spending was the change in her attitude, especially towards me. When we were with David, she was the perfect doting daughter. But in the rare moments we were alone, a cold, dismissive impatience would surface. She would ask about my life, but her eyes would be on her phone. She started to make small cutting remarks about my home, my truck, my life. "Daddy, you really should think about getting a new sofa," she'd say, wrinkling her nose at the comfortable, worn armchair that had been my wife's favorite. "This one is just so dated." But she was not just my daughter anymore. She was a curator, and I was an old, embarrassing piece of furniture from a past collection that she was eager to put into storage. The breaking point, the moment that turned my vague unease into a cold, necessary resolve, came on a Tuesday afternoon about 6 months before the wedding. I had stopped by their apartment to drop off a small, hand-carved jewelry box I had made for her as an engagement gift. David was at work, and Lena was home directing 2 men who were installing a new, ridiculously complicated sound system. She barely acknowledged me, just pointed to a space on the counter where I could set the gift. As I was leaving, I overheard her on the phone with one of her bridesmaids, her voice a low, confidential murmur. "No, he's not here," she was saying. "Just my dad. He dropped off some little wooden thing he made. It's sweet, I guess. I'll probably just put it in a closet somewhere. It doesn't really go with the aesthetic." A little wooden thing. I had spent 40 hours on that box, carefully shaping the dovetail joints, sanding the walnut until it felt like silk, rubbing in the oil until the grain shone with a deep inner light. It was a piece of me, a piece of my love. And to her, it was just a little wooden thing that didn't match her new sofa. I walked out of that apartment, and I sat in my truck for a long time. The hurt was a physical thing, a dull ache in my chest. But underneath the hurt was a new cold clarity. This wasn't about me anymore. My daughter's disrespect was my own burden to bear. This was about David, a good, honest man who was pouring his entire life, his entire heart, and his entire bank account into a woman who saw love as an aesthetic and who saw a gift from the heart as a piece of clutter to be hidden in a closet. He was walking blind and happy towards a lifetime with a woman whose heart I now truly believed had a hole in the middle of it. And my conscience, the part of me that my wife had always trusted, would not let me stand by and watch it happen. I drove home and I made the hardest decision of my life. I knew I couldn't confront her. She would just lie and she would turn David against me. I needed the truth, an impartial, undeniable truth. That night, after hours of staring at the ceiling, I went to my computer and I searched for the name of a man a friend of mine from the force had once mentioned. Frank Barnes, a private investigator, a discreet professional man who found things out for a living. My hand was shaking as I dialed the number. It felt like a betrayal. It felt like the act of a terrible, suspicious father. But as I listened to the phone ring, I told myself what I had to believe. This was not an act of suspicion against my daughter. This was an act of protection for my son. I was not looking for a reason to stop the wedding. I was praying with every fiber of my being that Frank Barnes would find nothing, that he would prove to me that all my fears were just the paranoid ramblings of a sad old man. I was paying him to prove me wrong. It was a prayer that would not be answered. Of course, I will continue writing the story, ensuring that these chapters are detailed, emotionally resonant, and adhere to the 1,500-word count for each segment as requested. Here are the next 2 chapters detailing the painful discovery. The weeks after I hired Frank Barnes were a special kind of hell. It was a hell of my own, making a quiet, internal torment of waiting. Every day I woke up with a knot of dread in my stomach and I went to bed with it still there. A part of me, the father, prayed that Frank Barnes would call and say, "Mr. Jordan, I'm sorry to have wasted your time and your money. Your daughter is a fine young woman. My investigation has found nothing. You have nothing to worry about." I rehearsed the relief I would feel, the shame at my own suspicion, a shame I would have gladly, joyfully embraced. I wanted to be wrong. More than I have ever wanted anything in my life, I wanted to be proven a paranoid, foolish old man. The other part of me, the part that had seen my daughter's cold fury in the bridal suite, the part that remembered my wife's sad, wise eyes, knew that the call would come. And I was terrified of what it would bring. During that time, I tried to act normal. David would call, his voice full of an innocent pre-wedding excitement, and it was like a knife in my gut. He'd ask for my opinion on the band's playlist or tell me about a detail of their honeymoon plans. I would listen, my voice a hollow echo of the warm, engaged man I had been just a few months before. "That sounds wonderful, son," I would say, while a voice in my head screamed, "It's all a lie." Every conversation with him was an act of profound betrayal. I was a man who knew a storm was coming, standing on the shore, watching a ship sail merrily into the hurricane's path, and I could not bring myself to raise the warning flag. Not yet. Not without proof. Lena called too occasionally. Her calls were different. They were perfunctory, a daughter checking a box. Her tone was cool and distant, the anger from the bridal suite having settled into a kind of polite professional disregard. She never mentioned our confrontation. She acted as if it had never happened. And in her denial, I saw a new chilling layer of her character. She was not just a liar. She was an editor capable of snipping out any inconvenient truths from the story of her life. The call from Frank Barnes came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks before the wedding. I was in my shop, the sound of the rain drumming on the tin roof a mournful rhythm. "Mr. Jordan," his voice was a low, professional monotone devoid of any emotion. "It's Frank Barnes. My report is complete. I think we should meet." The knot of dread in my stomach tightened into a cold, hard stone. He didn't say, "I found nothing." He said, "We should meet." And in that simple professional phrase, I knew my prayer had not been answered. Where and when? I asked my own voice, a stranger's. We met at a small anonymous diner on the outskirts of the city, a place of cracked vinyl booths and the smell of stale coffee. It was the kind of place where secrets could be exchanged without drawing a second glance. He was already there when I arrived, sitting in a booth in the back corner. He was a man in his 50s with a tired face and the patient, observant eyes of a man who makes his living watching other people's lives unravel. In front of him on the table was a simple, thick manila envelope. It looked thin and harmless, but I knew it was a bomb. "Cal," he said, nodding as I slid into the booth opposite him. He didn't waste time with small talk. He pushed the envelope across the table. Everything you asked for and probably some things you didn't are in there. My hand trembled as I reached for it. The paper felt heavy, thick with the weight of a truth I did not want to know. "What did you find, Frank?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. He looked at me, and for a moment the professional mask slipped, and I saw a flicker of genuine human pity in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Cal," he said softly. "You were right to be worried." I opened the clasp on the envelope. Inside was a neatly typed report, and beneath it a stack of glossy 8x10 photographs. I pulled out the report first, my mind still clinging to the hope that I could understand this through the detached language of a document. But the words on the page were a brutal clinical demolition of that hope. The report confirmed it all. For the past 6 months, my daughter Lena had been having an affair, and the man she was having it with was not some stranger. It was Trevor Hayes, her fiancé's best man, his business partner. The betrayal was so complete, so breathtaking in its treachery, that it defied belief. The report was detailed a timeline of their secret meetings, their clandestine lunches, their late-night visits to a discreet downtown hotel. But it was the photographs that truly broke me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold them. The first one was of them in a restaurant, a dark, intimate corner booth. They were not talking. They were looking at each other, and the look in their eyes was not one of friendship. The second photo was of them in a parking garage late at night. Trevor was leaning against his car, and Lena was standing in front of him, her hands on his chest. In the third photo, they were kissing. It was not a gentle, stolen kiss. It was a deep, passionate, and desperate kiss. The kiss of two people who were not just attracted to each other, but were consumed by each other. I felt the air leave my lungs in a ragged, painful gasp. The world seemed to tilt, the cheap diner spinning around me. This was not a flirtation. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a full-blown, long-term affair. My daughter was not just betraying David. She was living a complete and total double life. "There's more," Frank said, his voice a grim, quiet thing. He pointed to a small white USB drive at the bottom of the envelope. "Video. From the parking garage. It's conclusive." I couldn't breathe. I slumped back against the cracked vinyl of the booth, the photographs spread out on the table before me like the wreckage of a terrible accident. This was the truth. The ugly, undeniable, and soul-crushing truth. My beautiful, brilliant daughter was a liar and a cheat. The wonderful, loving man she was about to marry was a fool, a victim in a play where everyone but him knew the ending. And I, her father, was the man who had just been handed the script. My wife's voice echoed in my head, a sad, ghostly whisper, a hole in the middle of her heart. I had thought David's love could fill it. I had been so wrong. The hole wasn't a void to be filled with love. It was a black hole, a thing of infinite hunger that consumed everything good that came near it, and it was about to consume David. "What do you want me to do, Cal?" Frank asked, his voice pulling me from the wreckage of my thoughts. I looked at the pictures, I looked at the USB drive, and I looked at the face of my daughter smiling and kissing a man who was not her fiancé. The father in me, the part that had wanted to protect her, to save her, died in that booth. It was replaced by something colder, harder, and far more ancient. A duty not to my child, but to the innocent man she was about to destroy. "Nothing," I whispered, my voice a raw, broken thing. "You've done your part, Frank. The rest is up to me." I gathered the evidence, the instruments of my own heartbreak, and I slid them back into the envelope. The bomb was now in my hands, and I had 3 weeks to decide when and how to detonate it. The drive home from that cheap, anonymous diner was the loneliest journey of my life. The manila envelope sat on the passenger seat beside me, a thin, harmless-looking object that contained the complete and total demolition of my family. With every mile that passed, the same terrible question beat a relentless rhythm in my head. What do I do now? What does a man do with a truth that will destroy everyone it touches? My first instinct, the instinct of a man who believes in justice, was to go straight to David. To sit that good, honest young man down, look him in the eye, and show him the ugly, undeniable proof of who he was about to marry. It was the right thing to do, the just thing to do. I would be saving him from a lifetime of lies, from a marriage built on a foundation of pure, calculated betrayal. I could stop the wedding. I could stop the crime before it was even committed. But as I pictured his face, his kind, open, and loving face, as he looked at those photographs, my heart seized in my chest. The truth would not just save him, it would shatter him. It would be a wound so deep he might never recover. He saw my daughter as the center of his world. To show him those pictures would be to tell him his world was a lie. I could not bring myself to be the one to inflict that pain. I could not be the executioner of his happiness. My second thought was to confront Lena, to storm into her pristine, perfect apartment, throw the pictures on her glass coffee table, and demand an explanation. To watch her lie, to watch her squirm, to force her to face the ugliness of her own character. The thought brought a flash of hot, satisfying anger. But I knew with a weary certainty what would happen. She would deny it. She would call the pictures fakes. She would accuse me of being a jealous, meddling old man trying to ruin her happiness. She would weep, she would scream, she would perform, and she would run straight to David, telling him a twisted, poisoned version of the story, painting me as a monster. And David, a man in love, would be caught in the middle, forced to choose. I would not do that to him. I would not make him the rope in a tug-of-war between the woman he loved and the man he respected. So by the time I pulled into my own driveway, a third option had begun to form in my mind. It was not the plan of a judge seeking justice. It was the plan of a father seeking one last desperate chance at redemption for his own child. It was a foolish, hopeful, and probably naive plan, but it was the only one my heart could bear. The plan was this: I would let the wedding happen. I would perform my duties. I would walk her down the aisle. I would smile for the pictures, and I would watch her marry a good man. I would give her the perfect day she had worked so hard to create. And then a day or two after, when the guests were gone and the excitement had settled, I would ask to meet with her alone. I would sit across from her, and I would place the manila envelope on the table between us. I would not shout. I would not accuse. I would simply say, "I know Lena. I know everything." And then I would give her a choice, an ultimatum. "You have 24 hours, my imaginary self would say. You have 24 hours to go to your new husband, the man you just promised your life to, and you will tell him the truth. You will confess everything. You will throw yourself on his mercy. He deserves to hear it from you. If you do not tell him by this time tomorrow, then I will." The plan gave her one final chance to choose honesty. It gave her the agency to be the author of her own confession, rather than the subject of my accusation. It was a cruel plan, but I believed in my heart that it was also a merciful one. It was a father's last attempt to save his daughter's soul, even if her marriage was already lost. That was the plan. For 3 long weeks, I lived with that plan, with the terrible secret knowledge of what was to come. And my plan was built on a single fragile foundation: hope. I hoped that my daughter, the little girl I had raised, the one with the bright smile and the quick mind, was still in there somewhere, buried beneath the layers of ambition and cold, hard enamel she had coated herself with. I hoped that her love for David, which I had to believe was real on some level, would be enough to make her want to be a better person. I thought of Ruby's words about the hole in her heart, and I allowed myself a foolish, fatherly fantasy. I imagined that once she was married, once she was secure in the unconditional love of a man like David, that hole would finally begin to heal. I hoped that the security of her new life would make the thrill of her secret one seem cheap and tawdry by comparison. I hoped that she was already feeling the guilt, already looking for a way out of the web she had woven for herself. My plan, I hoped, would not be an execution. It would be a liberation. It would be the painful, necessary push she needed to do what she already knew in her heart was right. It was this hope that allowed me to survive those 3 weeks. It was this hope that allowed me to look David in the eye when he called to talk about the wedding plans, my own voice, a hollow performance of fatherly warmth. It was this hope that allowed me to endure Lena's short, perfunctory phone calls, her tone still cool and distant. I was carrying the weight of their future, a secret that was so heavy it felt like a physical illness. Every day was a performance. I had to smile, I had to act the part of the proud, happy father of the bride, all while knowing that I was in possession of a truth that would burn their entire world to the ground. I was clinging to the hope that when the time came, I would only have to light the match, and that she, my daughter, would be the one to choose to walk into the fire of her own accord to be cleansed by the truth. It was a beautiful, merciful, and fatherly plan, and it was a complete and utter lie. The manila envelope with its ugly and undeniable truths sat locked in the old metal toolbox where I kept my most valuable precision instruments. It was a strange place for it, I suppose, but it felt right. It was a tool now, a tool for a job I did not want to do, a job that would require a terrible and precise calibration. For 3 weeks, that envelope was the first thing I thought of when I woke up, and the last thing I thought of before I fell into a restless, dream-haunted sleep. And during that time, I held on to my plan, the Father's plan, the one that offered my daughter a final, quiet chance at redemption. I had to let the wedding happen. That was the cornerstone of the plan. I would not be the one to destroy David's happiness on the day that was meant to be the happiest of his life, so I had to play my part. And a father has a part to play at his daughter's wedding. He is expected to give a speech, a toast, a few heartfelt words. But I am not a man of words. I am a man of my hands. My feelings have always been expressed in the things I've built, the things I've fixed. A speech full of words I no longer believed felt like an impossible lie to deliver. So I came up with a different idea. A gift. I had called the wedding planner a brisk, efficient woman named Ms. Davies a few weeks before my world fell apart. "Ma'am," I'd said, my voice a little awkward, the voice of a man who is not used to dealing with such people. "I'm the father of the bride, Caleb Jordan. I was hoping to do something a little special during the reception." "Of course, Mr. Jordan," she'd said, her voice a smooth professional purr. "What did you have in mind?" Well, I'd explained, "I'm not much for giving speeches. My words get tangled up. But I was thinking I could put together a short video, just some old photos of Lena from when she was a little girl up until now, a little tribute, just a few minutes set to a song she used to love." The planner's voice had warmed immediately. "Oh, Mr. Jordan, that is a wonderful idea, so personal, so charming. The guests will absolutely love it." She had then gone over the logistics, the technical details of file formats and screen resolutions, words that meant little to me. But we had agreed. I would put the video file on a simple USB drive and get it to her AV technician before the reception began. It would be my speech, my toast, my one heartfelt contribution to my daughter's perfect day. That had been the plan, then a plan made by a proud and happy father. Now, in the terrible aftermath of my meeting with Frank Barnes, the plan took on a new and deeply ironic significance. This little video tribute was no longer just a gift. It was a shield. It was my cover, my reason for being involved with the technical side of the wedding, the perfect innocent excuse that would allow my final terrible plan to unfold. But first, I had to build the lie. I had to create the tribute. The weekend before the wedding, I pulled out the old dusty photo albums from the back of my closet. It was an act of pure self-inflicted torture. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had examined the evidence of my daughter's betrayal, and I began to sift through the evidence of her life, of my love for her. And the girl I found in those faded, glossy photographs was a stranger to me now. There she was, a tiny 1-year-old baby, taking her first wobbly steps in our old backyard, her face a mask of pure, triumphant joy. I remembered that day, the feeling of her small hand clutching my finger, a trust so absolute it was humbling. Where had that trust gone? There she was at 10, a smudge of motor oil on her cheek, a wrench in her hand that was almost too big for her to hold, helping me fix the engine of my old truck. She had loved the garage back then, the smell of gasoline and steel. She had loved my world. "I'm going to be a mechanic just like you, Daddy," she had said, her eyes shining with an adoration that I now knew had been temporary, a childhood affection that had been discarded like an old, worn-out toy. I found a picture of her at her high school graduation, her cap askew, her smile so wide and full of a fierce, boundless ambition. I had been so proud of her that day, so certain that her ambition was a good thing, a fire that would light her way. I had not realized it was a fire that would one day consume her own heart, and that it would burn everyone who got too close. One by one, I chose the pictures. Each one was a memory. Each one was a knife turning in my gut. I was creating a tribute to a ghost, a celebration of a daughter who I now realized may have never truly existed outside of my own hopeful, loving heart. I scanned the photos into my computer and arranged them in a simple timeline, a silent story of a little girl's journey to womanhood. For the music, I chose the song we had always shared. An old Stevie Wonder track, Isn't She Lovely? I used to play it on the radio in the garage, and she would sing along, her small voice, full of a pure, uncomplicated joy. As I listened to the music, as I watched the images of her innocent, smiling face flash across my computer screen, the man I had tried so hard to be the calm, resolute judge simply broke. I slumped in my chair and I wept. I wept for the little girl with the oil smudge on her face. I wept for the good man she was about to betray. And I wept for the father who had to use a memory of love as a tool for a justice that was going to feel in the end exactly like hate. When the tears were gone, I finished the project. I saved the 3-minute video to a small black USB drive. The file was named lenastribute.mp4. I looked at the finished product, a lie wrapped in the beautiful, heartbreaking truth of a father's love. At the time, I believed this tribute would be the final, beautiful, and honest moment of her wedding day, the last grace note before the ugly truth of my real plan would have to be revealed in the quiet days to follow. It was my gift to her and to David, a final memory of a perfect day. I had no idea then that a single hateful phrase from my daughter's lips would force me to turn that gift into a weapon. I walked away from the light, the laughter, and the music of my daughter's wedding, and I did not stop until I was sitting in the familiar worn-out cab of my own truck. I closed the door, and the sudden muffling silence was a mercy. I sat there in the darkness of the parking lot, the distant, cheerful thumping of the party's bass line, a faint, mocking heartbeat. My own heart felt like a cold, dead thing in my chest. Human trash. The words were not just an insult. They were a verdict. A final judgment passed on me by my own child. And in that moment, something inside me broke. It was the father, the soft, foolish, and endlessly hopeful part of me that had clung to the idea that the little girl I had raised was still in there somewhere, buried beneath the ambition and the expensive clothes. The part of me that had concocted a merciful, gentle plan to give her a chance at redemption. That man died in the space between one heartbeat and the next, there on that beautiful, manicured lawn. He died, and the only thing that was left was the cold, hard, and unforgiving grief of a man who has just seen the absolute truth. The pain, a white-hot agony, was so immense it felt like it would burn me alive. But then a strange thing happened. It burned itself out. The fire of a father's broken heart consumed itself, and in its place all that was left were cold, hard ashes. And in those ashes a new resolve began to form. It was not the resolve of a father. It was the resolve of a judge. My pity for Lena, my hope for her soul, it was all gone. It had been a luxury I could no longer afford, my mind now cold and clear, focused on one thing and one thing only: David. The good, decent, and honest man who was at this very moment dancing with a woman who was betraying him in the most profound way imaginable. My duty was no longer to my daughter's soul. My duty was to David's future. I threw my old merciful plan into the fire with the rest of my fatherly feelings. My plan to confront her privately after the wedding, to give her a chance to confess what a fool I had been. I could see the scene playing out in my head. She would lie. She would cry. She would twist the story, manipulate him, and paint me as the villain. And David, a man in love, would be so confused, so desperate to believe her that he might just fall for it. The marriage would continue, a poisoned, hollow thing, and his life would be ruined. No, that was not justice. That was a coward's solution. The truth had to be absolute, it had to be public, and it had to be undeniable. The wedding could not be allowed to stand. The lie could not be allowed to take root. The crime had to be exposed, not in the quiet of a living room a week from now, but here, tonight, in front of the very people she was so desperate to impress. My mind, the mind of a mechanic who knows how to take an engine apart and put it back together, began to work on this new and terrible problem. I had the evidence, the ugly, irrefutable truth locked away in a toolbox in the back of this very truck. And I had a delivery system, a Trojan horse that I myself had built, the special tribute video, the charming personal touch that the wedding planner had so loved, the innocent slideshow of a little girl's life. The new plan formed in my mind, not in a flash of inspiration, but with the cold, hard, and inevitable logic of a blueprint. My original plan had been to give a gift of love. My new plan was to deliver a judgment, and the stage was already set. My hand, which had been trembling just an hour before, was now perfectly steady. I reached for my phone. I scrolled through the contacts, my thumb moving with a new grim purpose. I had asked Frank Barnes, the private investigator, to stay in the area on the wedding day. I had told myself it was just a precaution, a loose end to be tied up. But a deeper, colder part of me, the part that had listened to my wife's warnings for years, must have known that it might come to this. I found his name and I pressed the call button. He answered on the second ring, his voice the same calm, professional monotone. "Barnes?" "Frank, it's Caleb Jordan." I said, my own voice, a low, steady thing I did not recognize. "Where are you?" "I'm at the hotel, just as we discussed, Cal," he said. "About 5 miles from the resort. Is everything okay?" "Did you talk to her?" "I talked to her," I said, my voice flat. "The plan has changed, drastically. I need the package. The video file you prepared. Can you get it onto a simple unlabeled USB drive?" There was a short pause on the other end. Frank was a professional. He did not ask for the details. He only needed the logistics. "Already on a drive just in case," he said. "Where and when?" I thought for a moment, my mind a cold, clear machine. "There's an all-night diner about halfway between you and the resort. The one with the big coffee cup sign. I'll be there in 20 minutes. "I'm on my way," he said, and the line went dead. I put the phone down. It was done. The decision was irrevocable. I had just set in motion an act of destruction so profound it would shatter my own family. But as I started the truck's engine, I felt no guilt. I felt no hesitation. I felt only the cold, clean, and terrible weight of a necessary justice. I drove out of the parking lot, away from the glittering lights of my daughter's wedding, and I headed for my rendezvous. I was no longer a guest. I was no longer a father. I was a courier on my way to pick up a weapon of mass destruction. I was the first to arrive at the diner. It was a stark contrast to the resort, a place of fluorescent lights, cracked vinyl booths, and the comforting smell of old coffee and frying bacon. This was my world, a world of simple, honest things. I slid into a booth, ordered a black coffee I had no intention of drinking, and I waited. The minutes ticked by, each one a slow, heavy drop of time. I was not nervous. The man who had been a bundle of hurt and confusion an hour ago was gone. In his place was a man with a singular, terrible purpose. I was a mechanic who had discovered a fatal flaw in a piece of machinery. My job now was to shut it down before it hurt anyone else. It was that simple. My love for my daughter, my hope for her, my pity for her, it had all been burned away by the acid of her own words. All that was left was my duty to David, a duty to the son I had never had to protect him from the daughter I wished I no longer did. I thought of Ruby. I thought of her wisdom, her gentle warnings. I had failed her for so long by not listening. But tonight, I would not fail her. This act of terrible, necessary justice would be my final, silent tribute to her memory. I was not just acting for myself or for David. I was acting for her. The bell over the diner door jingled and Frank Barnes walked in. He was holding a small padded envelope in his hand. He slid into the booth opposite me and placed it on the table between us. The package that contained the end of my daughter's world. The drive to the diner was a journey from one world to another. I left the manicured perfection of the resort behind the world of fairy tales and beautiful lies, and I drove back into the real world. A world of cracked asphalt, flickering neon signs, and the quiet, weary honesty of a city late at night. The diner was a small, unassuming place, an island of light in the darkness, a place I had been 100 times before after a long shift at the depot. It was my territory, and it was the perfect place to plan a war. Frank Barnes was already there, as I knew he would be. He was sitting in a booth in the back corner, a cup of coffee in front of him, looking for all the world like a tired, off-duty salesman. But his eyes, the eyes that had seen the ugly truth of my daughter's life, missed nothing. They watched me as I slid into the vinyl seat opposite him, and in them I saw no judgment, only a quiet, professional readiness. "Cal," he said with a simple nod, "I got your call. I'm sorry for what you're going through." "The time for sorry is past, Frank," I said, my voice a low, steady thing that did not sound like my own. "My original plan, the one where I talked to her after the wedding, it's no longer viable. The situation has changed. I need to accelerate the timeline. tonight." Frank took a slow sip of his coffee. He was a professional and his job was to provide information, not to give advice, but he was also a decent man. "Cal," he said, his voice quiet, "are you sure about this? Whatever you're planning, if it's for tonight, it will be a public and permanent move. There's no coming back from it." I thought of my daughter's face, her eyes full of a cold, triumphant contempt as she called me trash. I thought of David's face, his eyes full of a pure, trusting love as he looked at her at the altar. And I thought of my wife, Ruby, her voice a whisper in my memory, warning me of the hole in our daughter's heart. "I'm sure," I said, my voice as hard and as cold as the Formica tabletop. "She made it necessary. Now you have the package." He nodded, reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a small padded envelope. My heart, which I had thought was a dead cold stone, gave a painful, heavy thud. He placed it on the table. "As requested," he said. "The video file is on a standard USB drive. It's clean, no labels. The file itself is a simple MP4. It will play on any system. It's exactly 52 seconds long." I reached into my own jacket pocket and pulled out the USB drive I had so carefully prepared just a few days before. The one with the pictures of her as a little girl, the one set to the Stevie Wonder song, the tribute to the daughter I thought I had. It felt like a relic from a different lifetime. I slid it across the table to him. "This is the one I was going to use," I said. "A slideshow of her childhood. It's 3 minutes long. The file is named Lena's Tribute to MP4. He took my USB drive and slid the padded envelope towards me. For a moment our hands were close on the table, a quiet, somber exchange of one life for another. I picked up the envelope. I could feel the small, hard rectangle of the USB drive inside. This was it. The weapon. The truth. This tiny piece of plastic and metal held the end of my daughter's world. I had one last fleeting flash of her as a little girl, a smear of grease on her nose, her eyes shining with adoration as she looked up at me in the garage. A father's love. I learned in that moment does not die easily. It just gets buried. I pushed the memory down deep into the cold ashes where the rest of my love for her now resided. And I replaced it with the image of David's face so full of a trust that was about to be so brutally betrayed. This was not for me. This was for him. This was the only act of protection I had left to give. "The file on your drive, Frank," I said, my voice now all business. "What is it named?" "The Truth MP4, he replied. I nodded. "Okay, I need you to do one last thing for me. I need you to rename that file. Rename it to Lena's Tribute.mp4, exactly like the one I just gave you." Frank looked at me, a new level of understanding dawning in his tired eyes. He was finally seeing the full, terrible shape of my plan. He didn't flinch. He just gave a slow, somber nod. "I'll do it on my laptop in the car," he said. "It'll take 2 minutes." Now came the performance. I pulled out my phone and found the number the wedding planner, Ms. Davies, had given me, the number for the on-site AV technician. I took a deep breath and I dialed. As the phone rang, I forced myself to become a different man. Not the cold, resolute judge, but a flustered, emotional, and slightly overwhelmed father of the bride. A young, hurried voice answered. "AV, this is Kevin." "Kevin." I began, my voice intentionally, a little shaky, a little thick with a manufactured emotion. "My name is Caleb Jordan. I'm Lena's father. I am so sorry to bother you. I know you must be so busy." "Oh, hey, Mr. Jordan," he said, his voice softening. "No problem. Is everything okay?" Yes, it's just..." I paused as if gathering myself. "I was just looking at the tribute video I sent over, the one for my daughter. And I realized, this is so foolish of me. I realized I left out a few very important pictures of her mother Ruby, who passed away. I just can't bear the thought of it playing without her in it more. It wouldn't be right." I let my voice crack just a little. It was a masterful performance fueled by a real and terrible grief. "Oh, wow, Mr. Jordan, I'm so sorry," the young man said, his sympathy immediate and genuine. "Of course I understand." "I've made the changes," I said, pressing my advantage. "I've put the new version on a new drive. I'm a bit shaken up right now, a little emotional. Would it be all right if I had a good friend of mine, a Mr. Barnes, drop it off to you? He's just a few minutes away from the resort. You would just need to swap it with the old one. The file name is exactly the same, Lena's Tribute MP4. It should be easy. Yeah, of course, he said quickly. No problem at all. Just have him ask for Kevin at the AV booth behind the main stage. I'll take care of it. Thank you, son, I said, my voice full of a gratitude I did not feel. You don't know what this means to me. I ended the call. The plan was in motion. Frank had already gone out to his car to rename the file. He came back a few minutes later and placed the newly programmed USB drive, the real weapon, on the table. It's done, he said. I gave him the other drive, the one with the innocent pictures of my daughter's childhood. Give this to the technician, I said. Thank you, Frank, for everything. He just nodded, took the drive, and left the diner without another word. The die was cast. There was no turning back. I sat there alone in the booth, the coffee in my cup now cold and bitter. I had just sentenced my own daughter. I had used the memory of her loving mother as a tool in her destruction. I had lied and manipulated and plotted. I had become a man I did not recognize. But as I sat there in the quiet of that cheap diner, I did not feel guilt. I did not feel triumph. I felt only the heavy, somber weight of a judge who has just passed a necessary but terrible sentence. I thought of David, his happy, trusting face. This was for him. This was for the truth. And I would bear the weight of it for the rest of my days. All that was left to do now was to wait for the sound of the explosion I had just triggered. The diner was an island of fluorescent light in the vast, dark ocean of the night. Frank Barnes had left a ghost slipping out the door on his way to deliver the weapon I had just armed. I was left alone in the booth with a cold cup of coffee and the heavy, silent weight of what was to come. I had set a bomb to go off in the middle of my own daughter's life, and the timer was now ticking. All I could do was sit and wait and picture the scene as it would unfold. I knew the wedding schedule by heart. Lena, a master planner, had emailed it to me weeks ago. The cocktail hour, the dinner, and then at 9 o'clock, the toasts. As the clock on the diner wall ticked past 9, I closed my eyes and my mind traveled back to that grand oceanfront terrace. I could see it all as if I were a ghost hovering in the corner of the room. The dinner would be over by now. The guests, full of expensive food and even more expensive wine, would be happy, loud, and blissfully unaware. The jazz band would be playing a soft, sophisticated melody. The air would be filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses. It would be the absolute peak of my daughter's perfect, curated evening. Then the MC, a man with a smooth, professional voice, would step up to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. It is now time for our traditional toasts to the happy couple. A round of cheerful applause. He would, of course, begin by introducing the best man, Trevor Hayes. I can picture him standing up, a vision of slick, handsome confidence in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. He would raise his glass, a predatory smile playing on his lips. He was the secret victor in this room, a wolf in the middle of a flock of oblivious sheep. His speech, I'm sure, would be a masterpiece of audacity, a symphony of double meanings that only he and my daughter would understand. For those of you who don't know me, he would begin, his voice smooth as silk. I'm Trevor Hayes, and I'm not just David's business partner. I'm his best friend. I've known this man for 10 years. I've seen him close the biggest deals of his career, and I've seen him celebrate the victories. And I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt that this, he would say, gesturing to Lena, is the single greatest acquisition he has ever made. A smattering of polite laughter from the crowd. They would hear a business metaphor. I would hear a confession. David is a man of vision, he'd continue, turning his gaze to David. He sees a project, he sees the potential, and he will do whatever it takes to make it his. He is a man who always gets what he wants. And from the moment he first laid eyes on Lena, we all knew. It was a done deal. He would then turn his charming reptilian gaze on my daughter. Lena, you are brilliant, beautiful, and you have made my best friend the happiest man on earth. I have never seen him so invested. We all wish you a lifetime of happiness and, of course, a very, very profitable future together. To David and Lena, the crowd would cheer, raising their glasses. Trevor would sit down, a triumphant smirk on his face. He was toasting the man he was betraying with the woman he was betraying him with, in a room full of people who were applauding their own deception. The sheer breathtaking arrogance of it was a crime in and of itself. And then it would be David's turn. My David, the good man, the architect. The son I had never had. He would stand up, his face flushed with champagne and a pure, uncomplicated happiness. His speech would not be slick or practiced. It would be from the heart. It would be honest. And it would be the most tragic thing anyone in that room would ever hear. He would raise his glass, his eyes finding Lena's across the room, and the love in his gaze would be a physical, tangible thing. Wow, he would begin with a happy, slightly shaky laugh. Just wow. If you had told me 3 years ago that I would be standing here married to a woman as incredible as Lena, I would have said you were crazy. He would talk about the first time he met her, how she had walked into his office to discuss a design project and had, in the space of an hour, completely redesigned his entire life. He would talk about her intelligence, her fire, her ambition, things he saw as virtues, not as the warning signs my wife had seen. "She makes me better," he would say, his voice thick with an emotion so genuine it would make my own heart ache. "She pushes me, she challenges me, she believes in my dreams even more than I do. Lena, my love, you are not just my wife. You are the foundation of my entire world, and I will spend the rest of my life building a future worthy of you." The guests would be captivated, a soft awe rippling through the crowd. Lena would be beaming, her eyes shining with tears of perfect theatrical joy, accepting the worship she believed was her due. And then he would do the thing that would, in my mind, seal her fate. He would turn his speech to me, to the empty chair in the front row. "And I have to say a word about her father," David would say, his voice full of a sincere and profound respect. "Cal, I know he couldn't stay for the whole party, but that man is a rock. He is a man of quiet strength, of absolute integrity. He is the kind of man they don't make anymore. The kind of father I can only hope to be one day." He would raise his glass in the direction of my empty seat. "Cal," he would say, his voice ringing with a promise I knew he intended to keep. "I know you raised your daughter to be a strong, independent woman, and I just want to promise you in front of everyone here that I will spend the rest of my life taking care of her, protecting her, and trying to be a husband who is worthy of the incredible family you have raised." A final thunderous applause. I, the human trash, was being toasted as a man of integrity. And my daughter, the source of this whole ugly lie, was being celebrated as an angel. The irony was a bitter, choking thing. David's words, his pure, unadulterated respect for me, were the final confirmation. He was a good man, trapped in a beautiful, venomous lie, and it was my duty as the only other person in the world who knew the truth to set him free. The MC would be walking back to the microphone now, ready to introduce the next part of the evening. My part. The reckoning was at hand. The toasts were finished. David's beautiful, heartfelt words, his public promise to me, his declaration of love for my daughter, they had all been spoken, applauded, and absorbed into the warm, happy glow of the evening. The guests were comfortable, their bellies full, their spirits high. The band was playing a soft instrumental piece. My daughter Lena was at the absolute zenith of her life, the radiant queen of a perfect day she had so meticulously designed. It was in every sense the perfect moment for the execution. Sitting in that cold, greasy spoon diner miles away, I knew the schedule. I knew what was coming next. The master of ceremonies, the man with the smooth, practiced voice, would be stepping back up to the microphone. I could hear his voice in my head as if I were there, a ghost in the back of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, it wasn't that just a beautiful toast from our groom David," he would say, and the room would erupt in another wave of warm, genuine applause. David would be beaming, squeezing my daughter's hand. Lena would be looking up at him, her face a perfect portrait of bridal adoration. "Well, the evening is full of love," the MC would continue, his smile as bright as the chandeliers. "And we have one more very special tribute. The father of the bride, Mr. Caleb Jordan, had to leave us a bit earlier this evening, but he was so determined to share his love for his daughter that he prepared something truly special for all of us, a little surprise gift for Lena on her big day." I can picture the scene so clearly. My daughter's face would show a flicker of something surprise mixed with a hint of condescending amusement, her embarrassing working-class father trying to participate in her grand, sophisticated world. She would probably lean over and whisper something to David, a small private joke at my expense. Let's see what the old man cooked up. Probably pictures of me in the bathtub. David, on the other hand, would be genuinely touched. His smile would be wide and sincere. He would see this not as a quaint, clumsy gesture, but as a profound act of love from a man he deeply respected. He would see it as my blessing, my approval, my contribution to their perfect day. He would squeeze her hand back, his eyes full of an honest, unsuspecting warmth, and he would turn his full attention to the large projection screen above the stage. "So, ladies and gentlemen," the MC would say, his voice full of a cheerful manufactured excitement, "if you would all please direct your attention to the screen, a special presentation from a very proud father to his beautiful daughter." The moment would be thick with a sweet, sentimental anticipation. The guests, happy and a little drunk on champagne, would be in the perfect mood for a trip down memory lane. They would be expecting a charming, slightly sappy slideshow, a parade of cute baby pictures, awkward school photos, and proud graduation moments. They would be ready to smile, to laugh, to let out a collective sentimental awe. Trevor Hayes, the best man, the secret victor, would be sitting back in his chair, a smug, satisfied look on his face. His duties were done. His speech, with its clever hidden meanings, had been a success. Now he just had to endure a few minutes of sentimental family nonsense before he could get another drink, and perhaps later a quiet celebratory moment with the bride. He would be relaxed, bored, and completely, utterly unprepared for what was about to happen. He had no idea that his own starring role in the evening's entertainment was just about to begin. The lights in the grand ballroom would dim, a hush falling over the expectant crowd. The chatter would die down, replaced by the soft clinking sounds of forks being set down on plates. All eyes, 150 pairs of them, would turn to the large dark screen above the stage. In that moment, the entire wedding, the entire world my daughter had so carefully constructed, would be holding its breath. And as I sat in that lonely diner, the dregs of my cold coffee at the bottom of the cup, I knew that the technician Kevin, a young man who just wanted to do a good job, was at his control board behind the stage. He would have the 2 USB drives. The first one, the one the planner had given him, was the one I had originally made. It was a 3-minute video of my daughter's life set to a sweet Stevie Wonder song. It was a memory of a love I no longer felt. And next to it would be the second drive, the one my friend Mr. Barnes had so kindly delivered. The updated version, the one with the more important pictures of her late mother. The technician, following his instructions, would have discarded the first drive. He would have loaded the second one into his system. The file name was a perfect match, Lena's/tribute MP4. He would have no reason to suspect a thing. Back in the ballroom, the dark screen would flicker to life. A single elegant title card would appear, the white letters glowing in the dim, quiet room. It would say the words I had so carefully chosen, the final brutal twist of the knife. It would say, "For my daughter Lena, with all my love, Dad." The crowd would see a father's love. My daughter would see a final sentimental gesture from the man she had just dismissed as trash. David would see a promise, a blessing. They would all be watching the screen, smiling, ready for the sweet nostalgic music to begin, ready for the first picture of a smiling, innocent baby to appear. They were all frozen for one last perfect second in the beautiful, fragile, and utterly doomed world of the lie. The title card would fade to black. The room would be in complete, expectant silence. And then the first frame of the new video would appear. And it would not be a picture of a baby. The warm, happy glow of the ballroom, the soft murmur of conversations, the clinking of champagne glasses, it all hung suspended in a final, perfect moment of innocence. David's beautiful, heartfelt toast was still echoing in the air, his promise to me, his declaration of love for my daughter. A final, tragic grace note before the symphony of their life came to a crashing, discordant halt. The master of ceremonies, his voice smooth and full of cheerful ignorance, had just introduced my special gift. I can picture the scene, the moment I had both dreaded and in some cold, dark part of my soul craved. I, the architect of this destruction, was sitting in a cheap diner booth miles away, but my mind was in that room, a silent, invisible witness to the execution. All eyes in that opulent hall turned to the large projection screen above the stage. The house lights dimmed, and a hush of pleasant, sentimental anticipation fell over the crowd. On the head table, my daughter Lena would have been smiling, a look of indulgent, slightly condescending amusement on her face. Her foolish, working-class father trying to play in her sophisticated world. She would have squeezed David's hand, perhaps whispering a small private joke at my expense as they both settled in to watch what they assumed would be a sappy, harmless slideshow of her childhood. They were waiting for the sweet, familiar opening notes of a Stevie Wonder song. They were waiting for a picture of a baby in a bathtub. They were not prepared for the truth. The screen, which had been black, flickered to life. A single elegant title card appeared, the white letters stark against the darkness. It read, "For my daughter Lena, with all my love, Dad," and then it faded to black again. The room was in complete expectant silence, but the music did not start. The first frame of the video that appeared was not a faded photograph from the 1990s. It was a grainy, high-angle black and white image. A time code glowed in the bottom corner of the screen, marking a date from just a few weeks prior. The location stamp was clear: parking garage level 4. A low murmur of confusion would have rippled through the room. "Is this the wrong video?" people would have whispered. "What is this?" Lena's smile would have frozen on her face. This was not the slideshow she was expecting. A flicker of her familiar hot-tempered annoyance would have crossed her features. Her father, a simple mechanic, couldn't even handle a simple video file correctly. It was just another small humiliation on a day she had decreed must be perfect. David, I imagine, would have tried to laugh it off, a small, nervous chuckle, assuming it was a technical glitch, a mistake the AV technician had made. Then two figures walked into the frame on the screen. A man and a woman. Their faces were not clear at first. They stopped beside a dark, expensive-looking car. The crowd would have been leaning forward now, their confusion turning to a more intense curiosity. But at the head table, the first cold shock of recognition would have been dawning. David would have frowned, his head tilting. "Is that you and Trevor?" he might have whispered to Lena, his voice still full of an innocent confusion. And my daughter's heart, the hollow, ambitious heart my wife had always warned me about, would have stopped cold. Because she knew. She knew what was coming. The camera on the screen, the unblinking eye of Frank Barnes's surveillance equipment, was perfectly positioned. The figures were clear now. It was undeniably Lena in the dress she had worn home from a late business meeting, and it was undeniably Trevor Hayes, her new husband's best man and business partner. The video had no sound. It didn't need any. The images spoke for themselves, a silent, damning testimony. On the screen, they were talking their conversation, looking tense, urgent. Then the moment that had started it all for me, the moment I had witnessed in the garden, was replayed for 150 horrified guests. Trevor reached out and grabbed her arm, his touch possessive. He said something, his face close to hers, and she, my daughter, the bride, did not pull away. The crowd would have gasped then, a low collective intake of breath. This was not a friendly conversation. This was something else. And then it happened. In stark, unforgiving black and white, Trevor leaned in. And Lena, my daughter, the woman who had just a few hours before promised to forsake all others, tilted her head up to meet his. It was not a stolen peck on the cheek. It was a deep, hungry, and long-established kiss. It was the kiss of two people who were not strangers to each other's touch, a kiss of shared secrets and profound betrayal. The video held on that image for a long, brutal, and eternal 10 seconds. 10 seconds that felt like a lifetime. 10 seconds in which an entire world was unmade. The video was only 52 seconds long. After the kiss, the figures pulled apart. Trevor said something else, and Lena nodded. Then they got into their separate cars and drove away. The screen held for a moment on the empty parking space, and then it cut to black. The silence that fell over that grand, beautiful ballroom was the most profound and absolute silence I have ever imagined. It was not an empty silence. It was a silence that was full of the shattered trust of a good man, full of the exposed lies of a faithless woman, full of the collective horrified shock of 150 witnesses who had just been made accomplices to a social execution. The only sound was the faint, distant crash of the ocean waves outside, a sound that was suddenly menacing, a sound like a world washing away. The music was gone. The laughter was gone. The lie was gone. And in the place of all that beautiful noise, there was only a terrible, deafening silence, a silence so loud it was a scream. For a long moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The entire room was a frozen tableau of shock. All eyes were fixed on the head table, on the three people at the center of the wreckage. Trevor Hayes sat as if he had been turned to stone, his face a ghastly, bloodless white, his eyes wide with the sheer animal terror of a man who has just been publicly gutted. His own wife, seated beside him, was staring at him not with tears, but with a look of such cold, murderous contempt that it was a violence all its own. And Lena, my daughter, the beautiful, triumphant queen of her own perfect day, was gone. The woman in her place was a stranger, a creature of pure, raw panic. The mask of bridal perfection had not just cracked, it had been incinerated, leaving behind the terrified, guilty face of a woman who had just been exposed to the world. She made a small, involuntary movement, a desperate, pleading gesture, reaching her hand across the table towards her new husband. But David didn't see her. He was not looking at her. He was not looking at anyone. He was staring at the blank black screen, his face completely, utterly devoid of all expression. The happy, loving, and slightly naive man who had stood at that altar just hours before had vanished. The man who sat there now was a hollow shell, his eyes empty, his world reduced to a black, silent screen. When Lena's fingers brushed against his hand, he flinched. He pulled his hand back as if her touch had been a hot coal, a sudden, violent, and total rejection that was more damning than any word could ever be. A low, guttural sound, a sound of pure, abject despair, tore itself from my daughter's throat. And then David moved. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man in a dream or a nightmare. He did not look at Lena. He did not look at Trevor. He simply calmly placed his champagne flute down on the table. He stood up, his back straight. He looked at the man sitting beside him, a man I later learned was his lawyer who had been invited as a guest. And in the crushing, absolute silence of that ruined wedding, David, my good, honest, and heartbroken David, spoke. His voice was not a shout. It was a quiet, dead, and perfectly clear whisper, a whisper that every single person in that room heard as if it were a cannon shot. Divorce. The single word spoken in a dead, quiet whisper by the man who was supposed to be the happy groom was a stone dropped into the absolute silence of the room. Divorce. It was not a threat. It was not an emotional outburst. It was a verdict. A final, irrevocable judgment delivered with the cold, hard finality of a guillotine blade. And its impact was absolute. The silence that followed was different. The first silence had been one of shock. This new silence was one of aftermath, the quiet that follows a catastrophic explosion. The wedding was over. The marriage was over. The lie was dead. And my daughter Lena was at the epicenter of the blast. She had been reaching for David's hand, a desperate, last-ditch plea for a connection that had already been severed. When he flinched away from her touch, it was as if the last string holding her upright had been cut. The sound that came from her was not human. It was a low, guttural wail of pure animal despair, the sound of a soul being torn in two. The beautiful, confident queen who had held court just minutes before the woman who had so casually and cruelly dismissed her own father as trash was gone. In her place was a broken, terrified creature. Her face, which had been a mask of perfect bridal beauty, seemed to collapse in on itself. The color drained from her skin, leaving it a waxy, translucent white. Her eyes, wide with a horror so profound it was almost vacant, were fixed on David. But he was not looking at her. He would never truly look at her again. She began to shake, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that racked her entire body. Her breath came in ragged, tearing gasps. The magnificent $1,000 dress was no longer a symbol of her triumph. It was a cage, and she was a wild thing trapped inside it. No. She whispered the word, a ragged, desperate plea to a universe that was no longer listening. No. David, please. Please, you don't understand. But he did understand. That was the terrible, beautiful tragedy of it all. For the first time, he understood everything. He looked not at her, but at Trevor Hayes, and the look in his eyes was not one of anger. It was a look of cold, dead, and utter contempt. It was the look a man gives to a piece of filth he has just discovered on the bottom of his shoe. Trevor, who had been frozen in his chair, seemed to shrink under that gaze, his own arrogant facade crumbling into pure, pathetic fear. His wife stood up, threw her napkin on the table, and walked away from him without a single word, her back, a rigid column of fury. Their own private apocalypse had just begun. David then turned his movements still calm and deliberate, and he walked away from the head table. He did not run. He did not storm out. He simply walked his back straight, a man leaving the scene of a terrible accident. He walked past the silent, staring guests, past the beautiful, untouched wedding cake, past the 12-piece band who stood frozen by their instruments. He walked out of the ballroom, out of the reception, and out of my daughter's life. And with every step he took, the world that Lena had so carefully and so ruthlessly constructed was being dismantled. It was his departure that finally broke the spell in the room. The chaos began not as a shout, but as a murmur. A low, horrified whisper that spread from table to table. And then the exodus. No one wanted to be a witness to this much raw, undiluted failure. Guests began to stand up, their movements quiet, almost furtive. They averted their eyes from the head table, from the weeping, hysterical bride who was now being half-held, half-restrained by her bridesmaids. They just wanted to leave. The party was over. The performance had ended in a disaster of epic proportions. And Lena, my daughter. As the room began to empty, as the full public scope of her humiliation became absolute, the last of her strength, her defiance, her very will seemed to abandon her. Her wails became a series of low, choked sobs. Her body went limp, and she slid from her chair onto the floor, a heap of ruined silk and shattered dreams. She was no longer a queen. She was no longer a bride. She was just a broken woman lying on the floor in the middle of her own wreckage. I, of course, was not there to see any of this with my own eyes. I was miles away in a cheap diner staring into a cold cup of coffee. But I heard it all later from a dozen different sources. Frank Barnes, who had an associate discreetly observing from the back of the room, gave me the clinical play-by-play. But the most vivid account came weeks later from David himself. He told me the story not with anger or with hate, but with the profound, weary sadness of a man who has survived a natural disaster. And as I sat in that diner, knowing that the bomb I had planted had just detonated with a force greater than I could have ever imagined, I did not feel triumph. I did not feel the satisfaction of revenge. I felt only a vast, hollow, and aching grief. I had done what I had to do. I had protected the innocent. I had delivered a hard and necessary justice. But in order to do so, I had been forced to utterly and completely destroy my own child. It was a victory that felt in every single way exactly like a defeat. The celebration was over. The wedding was a ruin. And the cost I knew would be paid by everyone for a long, long time to come. The single word divorce was a detonator. It shattered the frozen tableau of the ballroom and unleashed chaos. The silence was broken not by a shout, but by 100 quiet, desperate sounds at once. The scrape of chairs on the marble floor, the rustle of expensive fabrics as guests scrambled to their feet. A collective, horrified murmur that grew into a frantic wave of whispers. No one ran. They fled, a quiet, orderly stampede of the rich and the powerful, escaping the scene of a social death with a speed that was almost comical. They were not just leaving a party. They were disassociating themselves from a failure so total, so public, it felt contagious. The staff, the waiters, and the band members stood frozen witnesses to a disaster far beyond their training. The wedding planner, Ms. Davies, was a ghost, her face a mask of pure catatonic horror, her career flashing before her eyes. And at the center of the wreckage, my daughter Lena was still on the floor, a crumpled heap of white silk. The sound that came from her was no longer a wail of despair, but a series of low, choked, animal-like sobs. Her bridesmaids hovered over her, their expressions a mixture of pity and a morbid, terrified fascination. They were trying to help, to pull her to her feet, but she was a dead weight, her body devoid of will, her mind lost in the ruins. David, I learned later, did not look back. He walked out of that ballroom and did not stop until he reached his car. He drove away from the resort, from his own wedding, from the life he had been so excited to begin just hours before. He did not go to the apartment he shared with Lena. He went to a quiet, anonymous hotel downtown. And that night he did not weep. He acted. He called his lawyer, the same man who had been sitting beside him at the head table, and he gave him his instructions. They were simple, direct, and absolute. The very next morning, at 9 a.m., as the doors of the Charleston County Courthouse opened, David's lawyer was the first person in line. He filed for an immediate divorce. There were no grounds for negotiation. The petition cited adultery backed by 150 witnesses. By the time my daughter had been coaxed out of the ruined ballroom and taken home by her stunned and horrified friends, her marriage was, for all intents and purposes, already over. It had lasted less than 12 hours. But David's justice was not reserved solely for Lena. He was an architect, a builder, a man who understood that when a foundation is rotten, you have to tear down the entire structure. The other part of that rotten foundation was Trevor Hayes. On Monday morning, an emergency meeting of the partners at his architectural firm was called. Trevor, I was told, arrived looking pale and haggard, a pathetic shadow of the slick, confident man who had given that smug toast just 2 days before. He had tried to call David all weekend, but his calls, like my own, had been to Malik in the other story, went unanswered. David was not in attendance at the meeting. He did not need to be. His lawyer was there and he presented the other partners with a simple, brutal choice. Trevor's actions constituted a clear violation of the morals clause in their partnership agreement. More than that, his affair with the fiancée of the firm's senior partner constituted a breach of fiduciary duty, a betrayal of trust that made his continued employment an impossibility. The choice was to either fire Trevor immediately and publicly or face David's resignation and a lawsuit that would tear the firm apart. It was not a difficult decision for them to make. Trevor was fired on the spot. He was told to clear out his desk, and he was escorted from the building by security, a final public humiliation. But David's reckoning did not end there. That same afternoon, Trevor Hayes was served with a multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit. David was suing him not for the affair, but for damages to the firm's reputation, for breach of contract, and for the intentional infliction of emotional distress. He was not just going to fire Trevor. He was going to ruin him. He was going to dismantle his life with the same cold, methodical precision Trevor and my daughter had used to try and dismantle his. I heard all of this in the days that followed, not from David or Lena, but from Frank Barnes, who had a network of eyes and ears that saw and heard everything. Each new piece of information was like a distant aftershock from the earthquake I had triggered. David's swift, decisive actions. Trevor's professional and financial ruin. It was a terrible, brutal, and efficient unraveling. I had planted the seed of the truth. But it was David, the good, quiet man I had so admired, who was now tending to its violent, thorny harvest. I felt a grim, terrible sense of satisfaction. The wheels of justice were turning, and they were grinding my daughter's world and the world of the man she had chosen over her own husband into dust. The chaos of the wedding night eventually faded like the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles that had silently arrived to escort the groom away from his own reception. The story of that night, the 52-second video that had detonated a marriage, became a legend in the social circles of Charleston. It was a delicious, horrifying piece of gossip that was traded over cocktails and polo matches for a few weeks, and then, as it always does, the world moved on. The story got old. A new scandal captured the public's imagination, and my daughter Lena was left in the quiet, desolate landscape of the aftermath. The legal proceedings were as swift as they were brutal. The divorce was finalized in record time. Given the public irrefutable evidence of her infidelity, Lena had no leverage, no ground to stand on. She walked away with nothing but the clothes on her back and the mountain of debt she had accrued on her personal credit cards. David, in a final quiet act of mercy, did not sue her for her share of the wedding costs. He simply erased her from his life as cleanly and as efficiently as a surgeon removing a tumor. Trevor Hayes was not so lucky. His life was systematically dismantled. Fired from the firm he had helped build, sued by David for a sum that would guarantee his financial ruin for the next decade, and divorced by his own wife, he became a pariah. And Lena, my daughter, the brilliant, ambitious queen of her own design, lost everything. She lost the beautiful house. She lost the access to David's seemingly bottomless bank account. She lost the expensive car. But more than that, she lost her status. She was no longer Mrs. David Clark, a name that opened doors. She was just Lena Jordan, the disgraced woman from that wedding video. The social circle she had fought so hard to enter, the friends she had so desperately tried to impress, they all turned their backs on her. Her calls went unanswered. Her invitations dried up. She had become toxic, a walking, breathing symbol of a spectacular social failure. I heard she had to sell her designer clothes and handbags just to pay her lawyer's fees. She moved into a small, anonymous apartment complex miles away from the glamorous world she had once inhabited. She was alone, disgraced, and for the first time in her adult life, she was poor. For 3 months, I heard nothing from her. A part of me, the foolish fatherly part I thought had died, wondered if she was okay. I wondered if in the quiet of her new humbled life she was finally beginning to understand, if she was reflecting on her choices, on the person she had become. I wondered if she felt any remorse. And then the calls began. The first time I saw her name light up my phone screen, my heart gave a painful, involuntary lurch. I didn't answer. I let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, the notification pinged. I listened to the message, my hand trembling slightly. Her voice was small, fragile, and full of a practiced theatrical sorrow. "Daddy," she whispered. "It's me. It's Lena. I really need to talk to you. Please call me back. I don't know what to do." It was the voice of a victim, a little girl lost in the woods. It was a performance, and I knew it. I deleted the message. The next day, she called again. I ignored it. The voicemail that followed was different. The fragile sorrow was gone, replaced by a note of sharp, impatient frustration. "Daddy, are you really not going to answer me? I'm your daughter. I'm going through the worst time of my life, and you're just ignoring me. After everything that's happened, please just pick up the phone." I deleted the message. The calls continued for a week, a steady, daily barrage. And with each unanswered call, the mask of the victim slipped a little more, revealing the cold, hard rage underneath. The final voicemail she left was a masterpiece of pure, unadulterated, and completely unself-aware fury. "Fine," she shrieked, her voice a raw, ugly thing. "Don't answer. Just sit there in your perfect, righteous world. You did this. You planned this. You wanted to ruin my life, and you succeeded. Are you happy now? Are you proud of yourself for what you've done to your own daughter? You destroyed everything. Everything. I have nothing, and it is all your fault." I listened to that final message, and I felt nothing but a profound and bottomless pity. I had been listening for a single simple word, the word sorry. I was sorry for what I did. I was sorry for hurting David. I was sorry for betraying you. But the word never came. The only word she knew was you. You did this. You planned this. Your fault. In the ashes of her perfect life, she had learned absolutely nothing. The painful public correction had not taught her humility. It had only given her a new person to blame. The hole in her heart was still there, and she was trying to fill it now, not with luxury goods, but with rage directed at me. I held my thumb over her contact in my phone. I saw the picture of her I had set as the caller ID years ago, a picture of her as a bright, smiling teenager, her face full of a promise and a potential that now felt like a cruel joke. I thought of my wife Ruby, I thought of David, and I thought of the man I wanted to be for the rest of my own short and precious years, a man of peace, a man of quiet dignity, not a target for a bitter woman's misplaced rage. With a final sad sense of resolve, I pressed the button. Block this caller. The phone asked me to confirm. "Are you sure you want to block this number?" "Yes," I whispered to the empty room, and I confirmed it. The calls stopped. The texts stopped. The connection, the final toxic thread to the daughter I no longer knew, was severed. The silence that followed was a clean quiet and blessed relief. It was the silence of a wound that has finally been cauterized, a peace bought at a terrible, terrible price. The months that followed the wedding were a long, quiet winter for my soul. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of wreckage and a profound, echoing silence. My daughter's angry, accusatory voicemails had eventually stopped, and I had blocked her number. The final toxic cord had been cut. I spent my days in the familiar, comforting solitude of my workshop, the scent of sawdust and the rhythmic scrape of a hand playing on wood, the only companions I needed. The work was honest. It was real. And it was the only thing that kept the ghosts at bay. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel joy. I felt only the grim, quiet peace of a battlefield after the war is over, a peace that is paid for with a loss so total it is almost indistinguishable from defeat. Then one Saturday morning in the early spring, as the first signs of new life were beginning to show in my wife's old rose garden, a car I recognized pulled into my driveway. It was David's. My heart seized in my chest with a familiar cold dread. I had not seen or spoken to him since the wedding night. I had followed the news of his divorce, of his lawsuit against Trevor, from a safe clinical distance, but I had never known what he truly thought of me. Had he seen my act as a necessary justice, or as the cruel, vengeful act of a bitter old man who had humiliated him in front of the world? I did not know. And now he was at my door. I braced myself for the final overdue confrontation. I opened the door, and he was standing there, his hands in his pockets. He was thinner than I remembered, and the easy, boyish happiness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, weary sadness that made him seem a decade older. But there was a new strength in his posture, the quiet resilience of a man who has been through a fire and has somehow impossibly survived. "Cal," he said, his voice a little rough, "I hope this is okay. Me coming here." "You're always welcome here, David," I said, and I meant it. I stepped aside and let him in. We stood in the awkward silence of my living room for a moment. "Can I get you some coffee?" I asked, falling back on the simple rituals of hospitality. "I'd like that," he said. We sat at my old kitchen table, the same one where I had made the decision to hire the investigator. The same one where I had looked at the evidence of my daughter's betrayal. For a long time, we just sat there, the only sound the soft drip of the coffee maker. It was David who broke the silence. He looked at me, his gaze direct and unflinching. "I didn't come here to yell Cal," he said. "I didn't come here to blame you." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I came here to thank you." The words were so unexpected they seemed to hang in the air between us, shimmering and unreal. "Thank me," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Son, I put you through a public hell. I humiliated you in front of every person you know. There was no honor in what I did." "No," he said, shaking his head slowly. "You're wrong. That night, it was the worst night of my life. I won't lie about that. It was a brutal public humiliation. And for a while in the weeks that followed, I was angry. I was angry at her, I was angry at Trevor, and yes, I was angry at you. I kept thinking there must have been another way, a quieter way." He stared into his coffee cup. "But then, as the anger started to fade and all that was left was the truth, I started to see it clearly. You didn't do it to me, Cal. You did it for me. You knew the truth, and you knew I was too blind, too in love to ever see it on my own. You tried to warn her, didn't you, that day before the ceremony?" I just nodded, my throat too tight for words. "I knew it," he said with a sad, knowing sigh. "She told me you'd given her a lecture. She was furious. I just thought you were being an overprotective father." He looked up at me, his eyes full of a new, profound understanding. "You gave her a chance. You tried to solve it with honor. And when she threw that back in your face, when she called you what she called you, you chose to save me from a lifetime of lies, even though you knew it would cost you your own daughter. That is the hardest, bravest, and most honorable thing I have ever seen anyone do." He leaned forward, his voice a low, intense whisper. "She didn't just betray me, Cal. She betrayed you. You gave her everything. And she threw it all away for... what? For a thrill. For the approval of a snake like Trevor. I'll never understand it. We were no longer a father-in-law and a son-in-law. We were just two men from different generations, from different worlds, who had been bound together by the same terrible betrayal. We were the survivors of the same shipwreck. I am so sorry for the way it happened, son, I said, my own voice finally breaking. I never wanted to cause you that kind of public pain. You didn't cause it, David said, his voice firm. You just revealed it. There's a difference. You held up a mirror and the whole world saw the truth. It was an act of mercy, Cal, a brutal, painful, and necessary mercy. You saved my life. We sat in a new kind of silence, then a silence of shared grief and a strange, unexpected camaraderie. The weight of guilt I had been carrying, the fear that I had irreparably damaged this good man, began to lift, replaced by a quiet, profound relief. He stayed for another hour. We talked not about the past, but about the future, about his plans to rebuild his firm, about my work in the shop. It was the easy, comfortable conversation of two old friends. When he finally stood up to leave, he shook my hand, his grip firm. Thank you, Cal, he said again, for everything. I watched him drive away, and for the first time since that terrible day at the wedding, the peace I felt was not the empty peace of a quiet house. It was a full and a warm peace. I had lost a daughter, but in the strangest, most unexpected of ways I had found a son. The visit from David was a turning point. It was a small act of grace, a quiet acknowledgement from the man who had been most hurt that my actions, as brutal as they were, had come from a place of honor. It did not erase the pain, but it eased the burden of my own conscience. The weeks that followed settled into a new kind of quiet, a quiet that was not empty, but was simply peaceful. I spent most of my days where I had always been most comfortable, in my workshop, the small, cluttered space behind my house filled with the comforting, holy smell of sawdust and machine oil. My hands, which had been idle and trembling for so long, were busy again. There is a truth in woodworking that cannot be found anywhere else. You cannot lie to a piece of oak. You cannot manipulate a block of maple. It is what it is, and you must work with the grain. You must respect the flaws. You must be honest in your craft. And in that honesty I found a kind of salvation. I was working on a small, simple project, a block of cherry wood that had a deep, dark knot running through it. The old me would have seen it as a flaw, a piece to be discarded. But the man I was, now the man who had been forced to confront the flaws in his own life, saw it differently. I decided not to cut the knot out, but to make it the center of the piece. I began to carve around it, shaping the wood into a small, simple bird, its head tilted as if listening, the dark knot becoming its eye, its heart. As my hands moved through the familiar practiced motions, my mind was quiet. The constant roaring loop of my daughter's words, of David's pained face, of the video playing on that big screen, had finally begun to fade. They were still there, of course. They would always be there. But they were no longer the only thing I could hear. There was no joy in what I had done. I want to be clear about that. There was no victory in my daughter's ruin. There was no satisfaction in watching her life, a life I had helped to build, be so publicly and so completely dismantled. I had taken a father's love, a lifetime of it, and I had been forced to watch it curdle into a judge's terrible necessary duty. I had passed sentence on my own child, and the weight of that judgment was a heavy thing to carry, even when you know it is just. I thought of Lena, not with the anger I had felt, not with the cold resolve I had clung to, but with a new and final emotion. A deep and bottomless and profoundly sad pity. I pitied the little girl who had grown up believing that my love was not enough, that the honest working-class world she came from was something to be escaped, to be ashamed of. I pitied the woman who had a hole in her heart so vast that she thought she could fill it with a rich husband and a fancy house. A woman who could not tell the difference between the solid gold of a good man's love and the cheap, glittering thrill of a back-alley affair. I had lost my daughter long before that wedding day. The girl I mourned was a ghost, a memory preserved only in the fading photographs I had once put into a slideshow. The woman she had become was a stranger, and I was finally peacefully letting her go. And I thought of David, the son I had found in the wreckage. He had called last week just to check in. He was slowly rebuilding his firm, his life. His voice was stronger. He was healing. He and I, two men from different worlds, were now bound by a strange and quiet friendship, a bond forged in a shared betrayal. In losing a daughter, I had gained something unexpected in its place. A connection built not on blood or obligation, but on a mutual hard-won respect for the truth. The final shape of the bird was emerging from the wood, its form smooth and graceful in my hands. I thought of my wife Ruby. I thought of her wisdom, her gentle warnings, her unshakable understanding of our daughter's character. I had failed to listen to her for so long. But in the end, in the most terrible way, I had honored her. I had done the hard thing she always knew might be necessary, and in that I found a final quiet peace with her memory. I set the carving down on the workbench. The afternoon sun was streaming through the dusty window, illuminating the small wooden bird. The knot, the flaw, was now its most striking feature. It was not a perfect piece. It was flawed and scarred and honest. And it was beautiful. I looked out the window at my wife's roses beginning to bud in the spring warmth. The house was silent. The phone was not ringing. The world was at peace. The war was over. I had done a terrible, necessary thing. Justice, as painful and as ugly as it had been, was done. I was not a happy man. But I was, for the first time in a very long time, a man at peace. I raised my daughter to be strong, but I never taught her that true strength lies in character, not ambition. Her wedding taught me the most painful lesson of my life, that sometimes a father's duty is not to protect his child from the world, but to protect the world from his child. My revenge wasn't an act of hate, but an act of justice for an innocent man. I learned that you cannot fix what is hollow inside, and that the heaviest silence is not the one of grief, but the one that follows a truth that has finally and irrevocably been spoken. Was I right to do what I did, or is there another way a father should have handled this? I would be honored to read your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe that sometimes justice must be served even when it's painful, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories.